Who gave Beelzebub his throne? Who whispered the first prayer to him? Who lit the first candle in his name? Who fed the first sacrifice to the prince of hell? You were told he is a lie. A shadow. A relic of ancient superstition. But his name has never faded. It has slithered through centuries, dripping from the tongues of the damned, seared into forbidden texts, scrawled in blood on asylum walls. Beelzebub. Lord of the Flies. Master of Rot. The demon of gluttony. But here's what they won't tell you, his name was never just a warning. It was a summons. His whispers didn't die with the old world. They live. They spread. They hunger. You can hear them in the low hum of locust swarms. In the distant, buzzing murmur of disease-laden flies. In the soft, insidious voice inside your own skull, urging you toward excess, toward indulgence, toward oblivion. Eat. Consume. Devour. He doesn't just want your soul. He wants your surrender. You think demons come clawing through the cracks of hell? That they arrive with fire and sulfur, screaming in the dark? No. Beelzebub is more patient. More cunning. He waits. He seeps into the cracks of civilization, hiding behind feast-laden tables, behind gold-plated greed, behind the grotesque hunger for more, more, more. The Vatican keeps files on him, documents so blasphemous they are locked away in secret archives, far from the reach of the uninitiated. They record the exorcisms, the possessions, the voices, always the voices. In 1632, in Loudun, France, an entire convent of nuns shrieked his name in the throes of unholy delirium. In 1975, a German girl writhed in torment, her lips whispering secrets of his dominion. And then there are the places they won't tell you about. The ones where the shadows are thicker, where the air tastes like decay, where the flies gather in impossible numbers. He was worshipped once, you know. Not just feared, worshipped. The Philistines called him Beelzebub. They built altars in his name, burned offerings, begged for his favor. But something changed. Somewhere along the way, he was cast down, branded a liar, a corrupter, a king of nothing but filth. And yet, he still reigns. You see, demons don't need cathedrals. They don't need followers. They need only one thing. An invitation. And humanity has been inviting him for centuries. So the real question is not whether Beelzebub exists. The question is, how much of him is already inside you? The air was thick with the stench of decay. It clung to the walls, seeped into the cracks of the stone, filled the lungs like a whisper of something old, something rotting. The single candle flickered against the damp, trembling in the presence of something unseen. A low hum echoed in the silence, not quite a voice, not quite a sound, but a feeling, crawling beneath the skin, gnawing at the edges of reason. The priest stood motionless, breath shallow, sweat gathering at his brow. He had been here before. He knew what waited in the dark. The flies, hundreds of them, crawled across the wooden table, circling the uneaten food, their tiny legs tapping against porcelain in a rhythm too precise to be meaningless. His lips moved in prayer, but the words felt hollow. And then, a voice. Not loud. Not thunderous. Just a whisper, slithering through the air like oil over water. You called me. The candle sputtered violently. The air thickened, heavy with something invisible, something unseen but felt. The priest's throat tightened, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. He wanted to look away, to close his eyes, but he knew that wouldn't stop it. It never did. Beelzebub. The name burned the tongue, a taste of ash and hunger, of something once divine but now drowned in filth. He had been an angel once. A prince of light. But light had limits. It had restrictions. And he wanted more. He wanted everything. They call him the Lord of the Flies, the Prince of Decay, the Demon of Gluttony. But those are just names. Titles crafted by men who barely understood the thing they feared. Beelzebub is not hunger. He is devouring. A force that does not stop, does not hesitate, does not break. He does not beg for loyalty, for sacrifice, for prayer. He does not need them. He only needs appetite. And humanity has always been starving. He moves through banquet halls where gold-lined plates overflow with food that will never be finished, where men gorge themselves while others starve in the streets. He sits at tables where greed festers, where hands shake with the weight of excess, where bellies stretch until they rupture. He whispers in the ears of emperors, of kings, of corporate titans, feeding them an ancient, insatiable truth: there is never enough. He does not come with fire and brimstone. No trumpets herald his arrival. He seeps in slowly, unseen, unnoticed. A voice in the silence. A suggestion. A craving. The old texts say he was worshipped by the Philistines as Beelzebub, a god of the heavens turned carrion lord. But history is a thin veil stretched over truth. What they call a god, they later call a demon. What they worship in one age, they fear in another. And Beelzebub does not care what name they give him. He only cares that they consume. The priest swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. He could still hear the voice, soft, coaxing, curling around his spine. One taste. That's all it takes. The flies thickened, swarming in the candlelight, their wings beating in a frenzied, chaotic hymn. They landed on the food, on the table, on his hands. He clenched his fists, shaking. He would not listen. He would not give in. But Beelzebub only laughed. Because he knew. Everyone gives in eventually. The altar stank of blood. The air, thick and humid, carried the scent of rotting meat, of old sacrifices left to fester under the cruel heat of the Philistine sun. Flies, thousands of them, swarmed the offering, their tiny bodies writhing in an undulating mass, crawling over each other in a frenzy of gluttony. The sound of their wings, a low and constant hum, filled the silence between chants, a noise that did not belong to this world. The priest stood motionless before the idol, his face streaked with sweat and something darker. His lips moved in a silent plea, though he did not expect mercy. Mercy was foreign here. Mercy belonged to lesser gods. Beelzebub was no god of mercy. He was hunger. He was the void that no offering could satisfy, the ever-open mouth that devoured until there was nothing left but bones and regret. The people knelt, foreheads pressed to the hot earth, their hands trembling as they scattered grains, spilled wine, bled for him. They did not look up. They never looked up. To meet the eyes of the Lord of the Flies was to invite something worse than death, to be seen, to be chosen. The statue loomed above them, ancient and grinning. Its golden eyes, tarnished with age and soot, stared into eternity. A bloated, grotesque thing, neither man nor beast, its arms stretched wide as if inviting worshippers into an embrace they would never escape. A cruel parody of divinity. The hum of the flies grew louder. The priest swallowed hard. Beelzebub was listening. He had always been here. Before the Philistines gave him a name, before the Hebrews cursed him as an abomination, before even the first men knelt in the sand, offering up burnt flesh to appease whatever lurked beyond their understanding. He was a god before gods. Not a creator, but a consumer. Kings sought him. They came with desperation, with fear, with gifts of gold and slaughtered animals. Some brought the sick, begging for their lives. Others, the dead, praying that his power stretched beyond the grave. But Beelzebub was not a healer. He was no deliverer. He took. And in the taking, he left ruin. Ekron, the cursed city, knew his hunger well. The Philistines whispered of the temple on the hill, where the priests moved like shadows, their mouths forever murmuring his name. They said the sick crawled there, their bodies rotting, their minds unraveling. And sometimes, when the gods of men turned their backs, when hope had withered and only desperation remained, they were granted an answer. A voice, not spoken but felt, pressing against the inside of the skull like bloated fingers forcing their way into the mind. Give more. Always more. Because gluttony was never just food. It was power. It was control. It was the hunger for everything. The sacrifice was brought forward. A boy. Barely old enough to understand why his mother was screaming, why the priest's hands were so firm on his shoulders. The knife glinted in the firelight, steady, practiced. The people did not look away. To look away was to insult the god. The flies thickened, their humming now a roar, a vibration in the bones, in the teeth. The air grew sour, the scent of rot blooming like an open wound. The boy whimpered. The priest hesitated. A mistake. The wind shifted, sudden and violent, as if the earth itself had taken a breath. The candles guttered. The shadows stretched. And the voice came, slipping between the screams like oil through water. Not enough. The priest gasped as something unseen wrapped around his throat, squeezing, filling his mouth with the taste of decay. He clawed at his chest, his lungs collapsing under an invisible weight. His vision blurred. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the golden eyes of the idol, gleaming, amused. The boy was forgotten. The mother's cries faded into the wind. Beelzebub had been fed. For now. The whisper slithered through the dark like a serpent. It coiled around the ribs of the fearful, pressed its cold lips to the ears of the devout, and slid through the mouths of priests like a curse disguised as prophecy. Beelzebub. The name dripped with venom, with rot, with something unclean. They spat it into the dust, carved it into scripture, wove it into the nightmares of children so that they would wake trembling, their hands clutching at the darkness to make sure it had not swallowed them whole. A name once meant for a god now belonged to something else. Something worse. The flies came first. They poured from the cracks in the walls, thick as tar, their wings screaming against the silence. They crawled over holy texts, drowning the words in a tide of writhing black. They settled on the lips of the faithful, clinging like an unspoken omen. The priests burned incense, chanted prayers, scratched lines of protection into the stone. It did nothing. The flies remained. They called it a plague. A punishment. A warning. But the old ones, the ones who still whispered of Ekron in hushed voices, knew better. The god had been desecrated. His name twisted, stripped, mutilated. Beelzebub, the lord of the flies, was no longer a god of men. He had been cast down, thrown from his altar, abandoned to rot in the filth and shadow. And what is cast down does not stay silent. It changes. The priests told their flock that the enemy had many names. That the great deceiver moved in unseen ways, twisting what was once sacred into something foul. They spoke of corruption, of gods turned to demons, of idols that still drank blood in secret. They warned of Beelzebub, the prince of filth, the lord of pestilence, the whisper in the dark that made men turn on each other with bared teeth. He had become something new. Something worse than a forgotten god. A devil. The stories bled through scripture like ink through parchment. They spoke of his throne in hell, a kingdom of rot and ruin, of worms fat with the flesh of the damned. They whispered of his voice, a slow, crawling thing, thick with the buzzing of 1,000 starving flies, each syllable dripping with decay. He was not a ruler of fire and brimstone, no glorious monster draped in flames. He was something baser. Something infesting. A corruption that did not burn but consumed. They said he walked among men, unseen but felt. That he slid between the cracks of their faith, his breath curling around their thoughts like damp earth over a coffin. He did not rage. He did not roar. He rotted. He weakened. He invaded. He did not need to fight when he could simply make men spoil from the inside out. And yet, the name was still spoken. In defiance. In worship. In desperate pleas muttered in the dark when all other gods had turned their backs. Some feared him. Some cursed him. And some called to him. Because corruption, when left long enough, does not just destroy. It transforms. The temple reeked of blood and fire. The air was thick with the scent of burning flesh, acrid smoke curling toward the heavens like a silent prayer. The idols stood tall, their hollow eyes drinking in the suffering that unfolded before them. Somewhere in the shifting darkness, a child screamed. The priests did not flinch. They raised their hands, their voices ringing out like the clang of iron against stone. The people trembled, caught between fear and devotion, their bodies slick with sweat. The flies came next, swarming the altar in waves, their wings humming like a distant, mocking laughter. They landed on the open mouths of the dead, crawled between teeth, burrowed into the wounds left gaping from the sacrifices. The people whispered his name. Beelzebub. Their god of Ekron. Their protector. Their plague. He was there in the Old Testament, his name spoken with contempt, laced with warning. The god of filth. The lord of flies. He was the stench of rot that clung to those who turned from the one true God. A name spat out in disgust, as if saying it too many times would invite the swarm to descend, burrowing into the flesh of the faithful, making them unclean. A king, desperate and dying, sent messengers to him. Ahaziah, son of Ahab, writhing in his bed, his body broken by a fall, sought answers from Beelzebub rather than from the God of Israel. His lips, parched and trembling, had formed the forbidden name. His men carried his question to Ekron, but before they could reach the god's priests, they were stopped. The prophet stood in their path, his voice like the crack of thunder. Is there no God in Israel? The words burned. Elijah's fury was not his own, it was something older, something righteous, something that would not suffer a rival. The messengers were sent back, their tongues heavy with doom. Ahaziah would die in his bed, just as he had feared. His prayer to the Lord of Flies had been answered with silence. Or perhaps something worse, a slow, rotting mockery of hope. Beelzebub lingered in the pages of Scripture like a stain that would not wash away. His name festered in the margins, spoken in hushed warnings, in accusations. The Pharisees, seeing the miracles of Jesus, could not accept them. They twisted the light into something grotesque. He casts out demons by Beelzebub, the prince of demons. The accusation was not just blasphemy, it was contamination. To them, this was proof that the power wielded by Jesus was not holy, but defiled. It was crawling with something unseen, something infesting. The name had long since decayed from godhood into something monstrous. Not just a false god. Not just an idol. A demon. The people flinched at the name. They had seen flies cover corpses in the heat of the sun, had heard them whisper in the ears of the dying. They had seen what rot looked like when left unchecked. This was what Beelzebub had become, a corruption, a sickness, a mockery of all that was sacred. The Old Testament had made him a stain. The New Testament made him an enemy. And the flies still gathered, still hummed their songs in places where the light dared not reach. The silence was unnatural. Not the stillness of an empty room, nor the quiet that comes before a storm. This was heavier, suffocating. A silence that listened. A silence that watched. It clung to the air like a held breath, waiting, pressing against the walls of the house where the possessed boy writhed in the dirt. His hands clawed at nothing, his mouth foaming as unseen hands gripped his limbs, bending them in ways they should not bend. His mother sobbed, her voice breaking against the silence, her fingers curled in desperate prayer. And then, footsteps. The crowd turned. Some stepped back, unsure, afraid of what was to come. He stood there, face unreadable, eyes burning with something deeper than anger, deeper than sorrow. The boy thrashed again, his voice shredding into a scream that did not belong to him. Come out of him. The command was not shouted. It was not pleaded. It was simply spoken, and the walls of the world seemed to shudder at its weight. Then, the silence cracked. A shriek tore through the air, something foul and unseen clawing to stay, to hold on. The boy convulsed, his body rising off the ground, his breath strangled in his throat, until suddenly, all was still. His chest heaved. His eyes, once wild and empty, blinked as if waking from a terrible dream. The crowd should have rejoiced. They should have fallen to their knees in praise. But their voices wavered, their gazes shifting. Someone whispered at first, a single voice dripping with unease. Beelzebub. It spread like rot in the wind. He casts out demons by Beelzebub, the prince of demons. It was not a question. It was not praise. It was poison. The words slithered between them, planting doubt, twisting what they had seen. The miracle was undeniable, but miracles had power. And power had origins. If not from God, then from something else. Beelzebub. The name alone carried weight, a god reduced to filth, a protector turned to plague, a name spat through rotting teeth. Once worshipped in Ekron, now a husk of what he had been, dragged from forgotten temples and thrust into the dark throne of hell itself. Not just a demon. A prince among them. The prince of demons. The accusation was not of trickery, nor of madness. It was worse. It was possession. Not of flesh, but of purpose. The man they feared, the man who healed with a word, was not a servant of heaven at all, but a puppet of the Lord of Flies. The thought curled through their minds like smoke, choking reason, feeding fear. Their hands twitched at their sides, as if reaching for stones. But he did not flinch. A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. The word struck like a blade. If Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then will his kingdom stand? The weight of them crashed through the crowd, shaking their certainty. They had seen demons flee at his voice, not gather. They had seen the possessed freed, not taken. But doubt was a disease that clung fast. The name remained, festering beneath the surface. Beelzebub. A whisper in the dark, a slur spat by the fearful. It would follow him, clinging to his shadow, turning righteousness into something foul. The devil did not need to win with force. He only needed the right name, spoken at the right time, to twist the hearts of men. And so the flies gathered, unseen but ever present, circling like vultures above the fate that would soon be sealed. The church bell tolled once. A single note, low and broken, crawling through the streets like something half alive. The wind carried it through the narrow alleys, through the stone corridors where candlelight flickered and men whispered of things they dared not name. It reached the marketplace, where a beggar froze mid-step, his empty hands trembling as he made the sign of the cross. It reached the doorsteps of houses where mothers clutched their children closer, whispering hurried prayers. It reached the cathedral, where a priest dipped his fingers into holy water and hesitated, just for a moment, before pressing it to his forehead. The sound meant only one thing. Another heretic had been found. The procession moved through the town in silence. No jeers, no shouts, only the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. The condemned man walked barefoot, his white robe dragging in the dust, his wrists bound in iron. He did not weep. He did not beg. The only sign of fear was in his hands, trembling, his fingertips twitching against his palm in silent, frantic prayer. A bishop stood at the pyre, his eyes like cold glass. He spoke the name with the precision of a man wielding a blade. Beelzebub. The word struck like an unholy curse, hissing through the gathered crowd. Once, long ago, the name had belonged to a god. A foreign god, yes, one of storms, of strength, of power worshipped in temples long since swallowed by time. But power does not fade. Power lingers. And when the old gods fall, they do not vanish. They are reborn in the nightmares of their conquerors. Beelzebub was no longer a god. He was something far worse. A prince in the infernal hierarchy. The prince of hell. The corrupter of men, the whisperer in the dark, the patron of heresy, of plague, of all that writhes and festers beneath the skin of the world. The transformation had been slow, insidious, spreading like disease through ink-stained manuscripts and trembling sermons. The scholars who feared him wrote his name with shaking hands, their quills dragging across parchment as if the letters themselves might burn through the page. He was no longer just a demon. He was a force, his presence woven into the very structure of sin itself. And now, standing before the pyre, the condemned men bore his mark. The bishop raised a trembling hand, pointing at the heretic. The accusation burned through the air. You have consorted with the Lord of Flies. The crowd inhaled as one. Flies. Always flies. Where Beelzebub walked, they followed, crawling from the mouths of the damned, nesting in the wounds of the forsaken. 1,000 black wings humming in the shadows, the sound vibrating through the bones of men who dared to listen too closely. The condemned did not protest. He only shut his eyes, lips moving in silent defiance. His faith was unshaken. But faith would not save him. The torch was raised. The flames caught. The first scream did not come from the pyre. It came from the crowd. A woman clutched her throat, her eyes rolling back, her mouth gaping in horror as something unseen moved beneath her skin. Another man collapsed to his knees, clawing at his own face as if he could tear the fear from his bones. The air buzzed, a sound not heard with ears but felt in the marrow, a sickening tremor beneath the flesh. The bishop hesitated. The wind carried a whisper. He is watching. The fire burned high, devouring flesh, consuming the condemned, but the people did not watch the flames. Their eyes flickered to the corners of the square, to the empty spaces between shadows, to the places where something might be standing. The bell tolled again. And the world shuddered. The parchment trembled in the old scholar's hands. The candle beside him flickered, its flame stretching toward the ceiling, as if pulled by something unseen. His breath came in shallow gasps. Not from age, nor from the weight of sleepless nights hunched over his desk, but from the words staring back at him. Words inked by hands that should have never written them. words meant to be burned, buried, forgotten. His quill slipped, staining the edges of the fragile manuscript with ink. His fingers ached from writing, from copying these forbidden names. Beelzebub. The name pulsed on the page, an open wound, black and hungry. No prayers could unwrite what had been written. No blessing could scrape the blasphemy from the parchment. This was not the Beelzebub of the sermons, the horned prince of hell, the corrupter of kings. No, this was something older, something far worse. The Apocrypha had whispered of him. The Gnostic texts had bled his name in hidden ink, pressed between lines that men of faith dared not read aloud. He was there, lurking behind the veil of Scripture, buried in passages that only the damned seemed to understand. The Testament of Solomon spoke of him first. Not as a prince, not as a lord of demons, but as a force, something that twisted the bones of men, that devoured the minds of the righteous. Solomon himself had stood before him, the great king wielding his ring of power, his seal that no evil could break. But even then, Beelzebub had not bowed. I move among men. I whisper into their blood. I fill their mouths with filth, their hearts with rot. Solomon had pressed the ring to his forehead, forcing him to kneel. But the demon had only smiled. You think you have bound me? You think the light of your God has caged me? I was here before the first man breathed, and I will be here long after the last man chokes on his sins. The scholar's hands shook. He had read this passage before, but the ink bled differently tonight. The words hissed. Something watched him. He turned the page. Another text. One older than the Testament. One not meant to survive. The Gospel of Judas. Not the Judas of betrayal. Not the cowardly wretch strung from a tree. No, this Judas was different. This Judas knew things. He had seen behind the veil, had spoken with voices that should not be named. And among them, he had spoken to him. Beelzebub was no mere demon in these lines. He was the gatekeeper, the architect of chaos. He whispered into Judas' ear, not with promises of gold, not with threats of suffering, but with something far worse. They have lied to you. Judas had trembled, had clutched his head as the truth gnawed at his soul. The kingdom he had followed, the path he had walked, it was all a game. A cruel, celestial game played between powers that did not bleed, did not suffer. And Beelzebub. He was neither rebel nor prisoner. He was the one who knew. The Son is a lamb, but the Father is a wolf. And I am the shadow they pretend does not exist. The scholar could not breathe. He forced his eyes away from the page, but the words had already seared into his mind. The walls of his study seemed thinner, the candlelight dimmer. The ink on the parchment writhed. Something moved beyond the door. A creak, a breath. He was no longer alone. His lips trembled in prayer, but the words felt brittle, hollow. The texts before him, the Apocrypha, the Gnostic whispers, they had already told him the truth. Beelzebub was not a prince of hell. Not a name scrawled in scripture to frighten children and trembling priests. He was something else. Something that had always been watching. And tonight, he was listening. The stench of rot clung to the air like a living thing. Meat, slick with decay, sagged from golden platters. Fruits, split open, bled thick juices onto the marble floor, where flies swarmed in a pulsing, black tide. Somewhere, unseen, a throat gurgled in sickening pleasure. A wet, gluttonous sound. The scraping of nails on silver. The smacking of lips too eager, too insatiable. The banquet stretched endlessly, tables sagging beneath the weight of food that never diminished, wine that never stopped flowing, mouths that never ceased chewing. Limbs too bloated to move, stomachs stretched beyond the mercy of flesh. They ate. They ate beyond hunger, beyond pleasure, beyond pain. Beelzebub sat at the head of it all. Not a man, not a beast, but something between. His skin glistened, damp with sweat, his mouth a gaping wound of teeth and hunger. A crown of flies buzzed above his head, a living halo of filth. His fingers, too long, too many, danced along the table, plucking at scraps, caressing bones licked clean. His belly swelled with everything and nothing, a grotesque void that could never be filled. He did not eat. He did not need to. They ate for him. They were priests once. Kings. Scholars. Holy men who had spoken of self-denial, of purity, of restraint. But restraint had shattered here, in this place where hunger had no end. They devoured with hands slick with grease, with tongues that had forgotten words. They were nothing but appetite now. A woman sobbed, her stomach swollen beyond recognition, her hands still lifting food to her lips, trembling, trembling. Her eyes rolled back, and her body sagged, finally still. But her mouth still chewed. A mindless, mechanical motion. A fly crawled across her cheek, dipping between her parted lips. Her tongue flicked, swallowed. Beelzebub laughed, a sound that was more a vibration in the bones than a noise. A great, wheezing heave, as if the world itself was choking. Gluttony was never just about food. That was the lie, the comfortable deception whispered to the weak-willed. It was never just hunger, it was consumption in all things. It was greed, but not for coin. It was lust, but not for flesh. It was power taken, gorged upon, hoarded, never shared. It was the swallowing of life itself, one selfish bite at a time. And in the beginning, he had whispered it to them. To the first men, who gathered more than they needed, who looked upon their neighbor's share and decided it should be theirs. To kings, who stretched their borders until there was nothing left to conquer. To priests, who craved devotion, who hoarded worship like gold. More. 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 There had never been enough. Not for them. Not for anyone. The monks who had feared him, who had tried to name him, to trap him in ink and parchment, had written of gluttony as a failing of the flesh. A sin of weakness. But they had never understood. Beelzebub was not a demon of weakness. He was a god of hunger. And hunger was the strongest force in the world. It did not stop. It did not lessen. It consumed. The feast before him was never-ending. The souls that sat at his table had long since lost their names. They had eaten those, too. A man, his fingers stripped to bone from years of desperate clawing, lifted a goblet to his lips. The liquid inside was thick, black. It reeked of spoiled wine, of something much worse. He drank, and his body seized, his spine snapping backward with the force of it. His scream was muffled by the thick gurgle of his own swallowing. Beelzebub leaned forward, his tongue flicking out, tasting the air. Satisfied. The doors at the end of the banquet hall creaked, ancient hinges groaning under the weight of eternity. A new figure stood in the threshold. Small. Thin. Hollow-cheeked, with eyes that still held a sliver of reason. Beelzebub grinned. New hunger had arrived. The candle burned low, its flame weak and gasping, drowning in its own wax. The priest's breath came in short, shuddering gulps. His fingers trembled over the pages of the worn scripture, but he could not bring himself to read. The words had long since lost their meaning. His stomach ached, not from hunger, but from something far worse. A hunger that was not of the flesh. The silence of the cloister pressed in, thick and suffocating. The wooden beams overhead groaned like dying things. Outside, beyond the monastery walls, the world had fallen into a restless, feverish slumber. The people gorged themselves beneath the glow of lanterns, faces flushed, hands grasping, mouths slick with excess. They did not know. They did not see what he saw. Gluttony was not a simple sin. It was not just the filling of the belly, the indulgence of the tongue. It was a wound in the soul, festering, rotting. A door left open, no, torn open, for something far worse to enter. He had seen it. The first time had been in the eyes of a dying nobleman, his body swollen, grotesque. A man who had hoarded not just food, but life itself, gold stacked to the rafters, lovers abandoned, mercy forgotten. His hands had clutched at the priest's robes as he gasped for breath, but it was not sickness that killed him. It was the weight of his own taking. And then there was the woman in the streets, draped in fine silks, her fingers adorned with jewels that glistened like stolen stars. Her lips had been stained red, not with wine, but with the blood of the ones she had consumed. Not flesh. Not bone. But souls. She had taken and taken, until the light in her eyes had flickered and died, leaving only a terrible, hollow craving. Gluttony was more than hunger, it was devouring. It did not stop at food. It seeped into the spirit, into the mind. It made beggars of kings and monsters of men. It whispered in the ears of saints, tempting them to take, just a little more, just once more. It filled cathedrals with men who did not pray, but fed upon the devotion of others. It poisoned holy men with power, made them crave the weight of obedience, the taste of worship. And the worst part, the part that made the priest's hands tremble as he traced the ink of Scripture, was that gluttony had no bottom. There was never enough. The church had tried to name it, to shackle it with words, to make it understood. But the truth was never written in the sermons. The truth was felt. The gnawing, the aching, the endless pull. The horror of knowing that the more one takes, the hungrier one becomes. It was a path, slick and steep, leading downward, ever downward. There was no stopping. No turning back. The hands that grasped at bread would soon grasp at gold, at bodies, at souls. A man could wake up one day and realize he had eaten everything, and still, he would not be full. That was why it led to damnation. Not because of punishment. Not because of wrath. Because by the time one reached the end of gluttony's path, there was nothing left to save. The priest closed his eyes, but there was no peace in the darkness. Only hunger. A hunger that had nothing to do with the flesh. A hunger that whispered, promising more. 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 The candle sputtered, drowning in its own wax. The parchment trembled in the scholar's hands, though not from the cold. The room stank of ink and fevered desperation, the kind of madness that comes when a man peers too long into the abyss and feels something stare back. He had traced the name too many times, felt it coil around his thoughts like a living thing. Beelzebub. The name tasted rotten in his mouth, like a corpse left too long in the sun. The ink had barely dried before the shadows in the study shifted. Not by wind, nor by flickering light, no, this was something else. A weight, an intrusion. The scholar's breath hitched. He was not alone. He should have stopped. He should have stopped. But men like him never did. Not when the truth lurked just beyond reach, just beyond reason. Not when great minds, minds sharper, more disciplined than his own, had walked this same treacherous path before him. Aquinas had written of Beelzebub with the precision of a surgeon, dissecting the demon's place in the infernal hierarchy. He was no ordinary fiend. He was not the tempter who whispered sweet sins into the ears of men, nor the brute force of hell's armies. No, Beelzebub was something worse. A commander of corruption. A prince of rot. Where he passed, purity festered. Holiness swelled and burst, bloated with unseen decay. Others had dared to name him the Lord of the Flies, but the title was an insult, a petty mockery of something far more insidious. Beelzebub did not simply swarm. He infested. He did not conquer, he rotted a man from the inside out, making him hunger for filth, for excess, for his own undoing. The scholar swallowed hard. Aquinas had feared him. A man who spent his life unraveling the mysteries of God had hesitated when speaking of Beelzebub. That should have been warning enough. But it was never enough. The ink-stained fingers of medieval monks had scrawled his name onto parchment, over and over, their hands trembling with the weight of what they dared to write. They understood what modern men did not, to speak of him was to call him. The scholar clenched his quill, his mind racing with the echoes of those before him. An age of theologians, of minds sharpened against Scripture, had tried to define what Beelzebub truly was. A prince of hell, second only to Lucifer himself. A corrupter of faith, the worm inside the heart of men. Or something worse, a thing that did not command hell, but fed upon it. The pages whispered as he turned them, each name, each description clawing at his reason. Saints had written of him with dread, priests had burned books to keep his name from spreading. And yet, he had always remained. Always waited. The candle flickered again. The scholar's breath turned shallow. He could feel it now, that weight, that presence. The room had not changed, yet something within it had shifted. His chest tightened, his ribs caged in something unseen. His lips parted, though he did not mean to speak. His throat was dry, his tongue thick with terror. The flies, where were the flies? There should have been flies. He had read the accounts. He had read of the priests who had glimpsed something moving just beyond their sight, just outside the edges of their minds. They had described the buzzing, the swarming hum of unseen wings. The writhing tide of filth that heralded his presence. But there were no flies. No sound. No movement. Just silence. Beelzebub did not need to be seen to be felt. The scholar squeezed his eyes shut, but it did not help. The name, the weight of it, pulsed behind his ribs. He had called him. Not with prayers, not with rituals, but with thought alone. With hunger. The same hunger that had lured theologians before him into endless debates, the same hunger that made men seek what should never be sought. The ink bled beneath his fingers, smudging into something unrecognizable. His heartbeat pounded in his skull. He wanted to stop reading, to stop writing, to stop knowing. But it was too late. The room was not empty. And Beelzebub was not a name. He was a presence. A hunger. A sickness. A thing that did not enter, it was already there, waiting, festering, growing inside. The silence was not empty. It was waiting. Holding its breath. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing against the walls like an unseen tide. Something had shifted, something vast and old, like a shadow stretching across eternity. The hierarchy. It was not a mere list. Not an arrangement of names scribbled by fearful hands on aging parchment. It was a throne of suffering, a structure built from agony, obedience, and betrayal. The weight of damnation pressed upon it, crushing all beneath it save for the highest, the mightiest, the ones whose names could still burn through the lips of the living. At the summit, there was Lucifer. The morning star. The fallen one. The great defier who would not kneel. Beneath him, his princes, those who reigned over sin like kings at a feast, gluttonous for corruption, engorged on despair. And there, seated in power, was Beelzebub. He did not rule from the shadows like Mammon. He did not slither and deceive like Belial. Nor was he the executioner, the mindless brute of carnage like Asmodeus. No. Beelzebub sat high, not just as a prince, but as a second king. A warlord of demons. A being so close to Lucifer in rank that some whispered of treason, of rivalry, of a hunger so vast it might one day swallow the throne itself. Some named him the Lord of the Flies. A grotesque insult. As if he were merely a scavenger of filth, as if his dominion was limited to the wretched and unclean. No. The flies were not his title, they were his heralds. A plague of writhing black wings, a living fog of sickness and decay, a feast upon all things holy. His name had been carved into history by those who feared him most. Medieval demonologists had written in frantic, shaking hands, their ink pooling in places where their fingers trembled too much to keep control. Some texts refused to name him outright. They knew the weight of names. They knew the power of rank. Because Beelzebub was not simply powerful. He commanded power. In some accounts, he was Lucifer's right hand, the general of hell's legions, the one who spoke when the fallen one would not. A voice that turned kingdoms to ruin, a whisper that could spread rot through entire empires. Others claimed he was something more, a usurper in waiting, an ancient hunger gnawing at the very core of the hierarchy itself. What did demons fear? They feared him. It was not mere brutality that placed him so high. It was not just strength, or intellect, or the poison of his words. It was dominion. A force so great, so absolute, that demons did not merely obey him. They served because they could not resist. His presence twisted loyalty into something foul, something diseased. A slow, festering corruption. What began as devotion curdled into servitude, then into madness. Even the highest of hell's lords were not immune. Even they, the horrors that lurked in the shadows of eternity, would bow their heads beneath his gaze, unable to understand why. And that was what made him terrifying. He did not break wills with chains. He did not rule through simple fear. No, Beelzebub invaded. Not just the body. Not just the mind. But the very fabric of what made a being whole. His rank was not given. It was not a title bestowed by a higher power, nor a throne handed down through time. It was earned through something far worse. Some called him a demon. Some, a god of blight, a carrion king who feasted on the rot of civilization. Others whispered that he was something else entirely, not born of hell, but something that had always been. Something that even Lucifer, in all his defiance, had never truly understood. But what was certain, what the ancients had scrawled in the margins of forgotten texts, what priests had whispered in dying breaths, was that where Beelzebub stood, nothing could remain whole. Not kingdoms. Not minds. Not faith. Only obedience. Only decay. The walls bled with whispers. Not sound. Not voices. Something worse. A pressure, a vibration in the air that made the skin crawl, the bones tighten. The weight of a question no one dared to answer aloud. Who ruled hell? The answer should have been simple. It should have been absolute. Lucifer, the morning star, the fallen one, the architect of defiance. But hell did not obey absolutes. It fed on uncertainty, on power struggles, on the ever-burning war of hierarchy. And in the heart of that chaos, one name refused to be ignored. Beelzebub. Not a simple demon. Not an underling. A force. A presence that even hell itself seemed unsure how to contain. Some called him the Prince of Demons, an empire unto himself, separate from Lucifer's dominion, answering to no one. Others whispered something more dangerous, that he was second to none but Satan himself, a right hand so powerful, so insidious, that the very foundations of hell trembled beneath his influence. And in those whispers, fear. Because to be second was to serve. To be prince was to rule. Which was he? Hell did not allow such questions to linger. Yet this one remained, festering like an open wound. The old texts contradicted themselves, as if those who wrote them feared their own words. In one breath, Beelzebub is a warlord, a commander of hell's legions, his voice carrying the weight of damnation itself. In another, he is a god in his own right, a rival to Lucifer, a king of pestilence whose power slithers through the cracks of reality, dissolving all order, even in a place that should be beyond salvation. The demons themselves do not agree. Some bow when he speaks. Not as soldiers, but as slaves. Others gnash their teeth, muttering of treason, of unchecked ambition. Yet none challenge him outright. None dare. Because in his presence, there is no choice. Something ancient lingers in him. Not the fire of rebellion, like Lucifer. Not the venom of deception, like Belial. Something worse. Something viral. A thing that seeps into the marrow of power itself, until one no longer knows if they are kneeling by choice or by necessity. Is he the Prince of Demons? If so, then he is a king without a throne, a sovereign of suffering whose reach stretches beyond the pits of hell, into the minds of men, the festering wounds of dying empires, the sickness that spreads not through force, but through inevitability. Or is he truly second to Satan? Then what does that mean for Lucifer? Because second does not always mean lesser. Second does not mean weaker. It means something far worse, it means patience. It means waiting. It means standing just behind the throne, watching, hands folded, eyes fixed not on the master's enemies, but on the master himself. And when the time comes, when the throne falters, when the morning star dims, who takes his place? The sky is wrong. Not black, not red, wrong. A vast, sickening void, not empty but full, pressing down, watching. There is no wind, yet the air writhes. No sun, yet everything burns. The ground is not ground at all but something alive, shifting beneath the weight of those who dare to stand upon it. This is Beelzebub's domain. No single myth contains it, no one story binds it. It does not belong to any one age or culture. It festers in the cracks between beliefs, bleeding through the nightmares of different civilizations. Some call it a kingdom, some a pit. Some say it is a city of horrors, its streets paved with the filth of the condemned, its spires reaching toward a sky that never forgives. Others say it is an endless, seething swarm, a hive of malevolence where Beelzebub reigns not as a king, but as a sickness, a force, an infestation that spreads and consumes until there is nothing left but suffering. There is no beauty here. No tragic poetry in damnation. No grandiose palace where demons debate the fate of mortal souls. There is only rot. Only decay. A place that does not punish, because punishment would imply justice, and there is no justice here. Here, there is only Beelzebub. Some myths speak of him standing on a tower of writhing bodies, a grotesque throne of those who spoke his name too freely, their voices forever silenced, their flesh stripped to feed the next. Others say he never needed a throne, because he is the throne, his kingdom is his body, and those who wander too far never return because they have become a part of him. There is no sky in some stories, only a ceiling of beating, living wings, stretching endlessly, blotting out all hope. They're buzzing a song of hunger, torment, and obedience. Some say the sound has driven men mad even in the waking world, that they hear it in the silence of their rooms, in the stillness of their minds. It is never truly gone. And the ground, they say it moves, shifts, pulses. That it is not rock, not earth, but something much worse. The bodies of the forgotten. The ones who were not condemned by law or by sin, but by neglect. The wasted lives. The discarded souls. The ones who were lost, who cried out and were never heard. Here, they are heard. They whisper beneath the feet of the damned, their voices rising in a chorus of anguish, not pleading for mercy but begging to be remembered, because this place is not fire, not ice, not torment. It is erasure. To be damned here is to be nothing. Nothing but food. And Beelzebub is always hungry. The sound comes first. A low hum, like the breath of something enormous exhaling from beneath the earth. Then the ground shivers, rippling outward as if awakening from some long-forgotten slumber. The air thickens, pressing against the skin like unseen hands. The silence before the slaughter. The moment when every instinct screams to run, but there is nowhere to go. Then, they arrive. Not in ranks, not in order, they pour forth like a sickness, a plague with no cure, an endless tide of nightmare-given flesh. Beelzebub's legion, his infernal swarm. The servants of the Lord of Flies. His children. Each one is a horror beyond reason. They are not demons as one might expect. They do not wear capes of shadow or gleaming black armor. They do not walk with regal poise or whisper seductive blasphemies. They infest. They consume. They move with the chaotic hunger of vermin, a writhing mass of filth and rot, a creeping infestation with a single mind and one purpose, to serve. Their master does not rule with chains or fear. He does not demand fealty with fire or force. They serve because they are a part of him. Each one is a fragment, a sliver, a shard of Beelzebub's will, scattered like disease across the fabric of existence. They whisper in the dark corners of the world, in the unseen places where rot takes hold, where decay is left to fester. They are the maggots in the wound, the flies on the corpse, the filth that breeds in forgotten spaces. Some are cunning, their minds sharp with malice, whispering lies into the ears of kings, poisoning the hearts of men with doubts that spread like infection. They do not force hands to war, they make men believe the war was their own idea. They do not shatter faith, they let it decay, slowly, until the only thing left is emptiness. Others are feral, gnashing things of pure hunger, nothing but teeth and wings and seething need. They devour what they touch, not flesh, not bone, but something far worse, the sense of self, the certainty of existence. Those taken by them are not merely lost. They are unmade. And then there are the ones that should not exist, the ones whose forms are wrong, whose shapes do not fit within human comprehension. They flicker in the edge of vision, shifting, twisting, turning inside out and back again. They are felt, not seen. A presence that lingers just beyond the threshold of sanity, a shadow that moves when nothing should. These are Beelzebub's greatest servants, the ones that do not need to touch you to consume you. They are already inside. The candle flickers, though there is no wind. The air in the room turns thick, dense, suffocating, wrong, as if something unseen is pressing against the fabric of reality, pushing from the other side. Shadows stretch where they shouldn't, curling along the edges of the walls like hungry fingers. Something is watching. A single name is whispered. Not loud. Not forceful. Barely a breath. But it is enough. The silence responds first, swallowing the room whole. The air tightens, pressing into the lungs, making every inhale feel like drowning. Then the sound begins. A low, sickly hum, not from a voice, not from a throat, but from everywhere at once. A vibration that trembles through the bones, rattles the teeth, fills the skull with something foul and rotting. It crawls inside, burrowing, nesting. The flies always come first. They do not buzz, not at first. They appear without sound, without motion, their bodies hanging in the still air like blackened pearls of sickness. Then, all at once, wings snap open, the droning begins, and the air turns to filth. Beelzebub is listening. There is no one way to summon him, no single method to call upon the Lord of Flies. There are only variations of the same mistake. The ancients bled for him, carving sigils into stone and skin, offering flesh so that he might take something greater in return. They burned sweet oils and rancid meats, mixing scents of pleasure and decay, because Beelzebub does not distinguish between the two. They danced in fevered trances, their eyes rolling white as his presence coiled around them, wrapping them in an embrace that never let go. Some walked away changed. Some did not walk away at all. And now, in this age of cold screens and sterile light, the rituals remain. The names are spoken. The circles are drawn. The offerings are made. Blood still spills, whether from self-inflicted wounds or the sacrifice of something unwilling. Fire still burns, its smoke curling into sigils that shift and twist into faces that do not belong in this world. And still, the flies come. They land on skin, on lips, on open eyes. They see what he sees. They wait. They judge. And if he chooses to answer, the room will never be empty again. The child had been silent for 13 hours. Not asleep. Not unconscious. Just still, her eyes locked on something no one else could see, her lips split open in a jagged grin too wide, too stretched, the skin at the corners cracked and wet with blood. Her mother had screamed, shaken her, begged, but the girl never blinked. When her voice finally came back, it didn't come alone. The sound poured out of her like vomit made of words, layers upon layers, the voice of a child torn apart by something older, something that should never fit inside so small a throat. The priest said it was Beelzebub. Not a demon, but the infestation itself, the rot that lives inside the skin, inside the bones, inside the breath. The voice spoke with no pause for air, no stumble, no hesitation. It knew names. It knew sins. It knew the things no one says out loud. It called her mother by her maiden name, her grandmother by the name only her dead husband had used, and her father, the things it said to her father left him weeping with his head in his hands, too ashamed to look at his own daughter. Flies gathered at the windows. They pressed their small, black bodies against the glass until the pane shimmered, a living curtain of wings and legs. They crawled over each other in a mindless frenzy, desperate to be near the girl's skin, her breath, the heat radiating off her trembling body. There is no gentle version of possession. No slow descent, no subtle shift. It comes like a fist around the throat, sudden and unstoppable, leaving fingerprints on the soul. They strapped her to the bed, wrists and ankles purple from leather buckles cutting into soft flesh. Not to protect her. To protect themselves. Because she was only 8 years old, but when the demon rose inside her, her bones cracked like dry wood, her body contorting into shapes the human body was never built to make. And her smile never broke. Not once. Beelzebub doesn't enter quietly. He doesn't slip between cracks or whisper through open doors. He smashes his way in, dragging every foul thing with him, bringing the weight of hell itself into the hollow space behind the heart. The records are stained with it, old ink scratched into ancient paper, names of the possessed burned into forgotten books. Women who screamed with the voices of men, children who spoke languages they had never heard, monks who gouged out their own eyes just to stop seeing what followed them even in daylight. The Ludun nuns, they screamed until their vocal cords split like rotting fruit, until blood bubbled from their mouths in sticky streams. They barked like beasts, writhed like lovers in the arms of invisible hands, spat obscenities so profane they made seasoned priests turn pale. They said Beelzebub had come to dance inside their bones. A boy in Spain, his mother found him standing in the kitchen sink, arms raised above his head, his skin covered in flies that never landed, only hovered, trembling in the air as though the gravity near him had changed. He spoke in tongues no one could trace, mixing Latin with something older, something built for mouths with too many teeth. The exorcist stood across the room, fingers wrapped around his crucifix so tight the wood cracked, and the boy only smiled, a smile too wide, too stretched, a smile the boy's face wasn't made to wear. Exorcism isn't a ceremony. It's a war fought in inches and screams, prayers thrown like knives into the dark, holy water splashed against skin that hisses and burns, the scent of cooking meat rising into the air. The possessed never scream in their own voice. They scream with all the voices inside them, the thousand flies trapped beneath the skin, each one speaking through the same broken mouth. Some exorcisms end with silence. Some end with death. The girl on the bed thrashed, foam and blood spraying from her mouth, her head snapping back with the force of something unseen yanking her spine like a puppet's string. Her lips pulled back, skin splitting wider as she spoke a name none of them could understand, a name too long for human speech, too short for human memory. The priest staggered back. The mother sobbed into her hands. And the girl, she laughed. Not the laugh of a child, not the laugh of anything human. It was the sound of wings beating inside her throat. They say Beelzebub doesn't leave easily. He rots his way in, spreads like a cancer that learns to breathe, makes a home inside the hollow places where fear lives. Even if the exorcism works, even if the demon is forced out, screaming and howling into the dark, something always stays behind. The girl who survived the ritual never smiled again. The priest who stood in that room drank himself to death within the year. The mother moved to a town with no church, no crosses, no reminders of what had once lived in her child. And the father left without a word, because some sins whispered by a child's mouth cannot be forgiven, even if they were never spoken in her voice. Possession isn't the story of a demon inside a body. It's the story of a body that forgets how to be human. And Beelzebub never forgets those he has worn. The flies always remember. And they never stop watching. The first scream tore through the wood like a blade, raw and shrill enough to splinter the silence. It was the sound of flesh and fear woven together, a throat stretched beyond what God ever intended. They had barely touched her, the priest's fingers only grazing her forehead in the shape of the cross, and already something inside her was burning its way to the surface. The name came before the confession. Beelzebub. They said it like a curse spat through cracked lips, a word that tasted of ash and bile. No one asked how she knew it, a name that had not been spoken in that village for 50 years, not since the last woman dragged through the streets had screamed it to the sky with her hair on fire and her feet blackened to bone. The flies came first. They always did. Crawling from the chimney, from cracks in the walls, from the soft, rotted wood beneath the floor. They didn't land on her, they hovered, trembling in place, as though afraid of what was already inside her skin. The magistrate stood with his hands folded, his knuckles white, his nails pressing half-moons into his own flesh as the girl shook and shuddered, her lips working against words that didn't want to come out. She hadn't touched the black book. She hadn't sworn the oath. But Beelzebub had found her all the same. In the silence between her sobs, the priest heard it. The hum. Low and thin at first, a thread of sound woven beneath her breaths, a vibration that crawled up the spine. A buzzing, a flickering, like wings brushing against flesh from the inside out. She screamed his name again. Not her father's. Not her God's. Beelzebub. They dragged her to the square at dawn, her feet bare, her dress sticking to her legs where sweat and blood had dried into a second skin. The sky was still black, the stars like shards of glass embedded in rotting velvet, and the air carried the weight of something unspoken. Every window was shut. Every door bolted. But they were all watching. Beelzebub had always been there. In the whispered prayers mothers spoke over cradles, in the corners of barns where animals died with their eyes wide open, in the cracks of hearthstones where fire flickered blue before snuffing itself out. He was the breath in the fields before harvest failed. He was the shadow in the well water before children sickened. And when the witch hunts began, he stood behind every accusation, smiling with too many teeth. They said Beelzebub came to the witches first as a voice, not loud, not clear, but soft, a whisper crawling from inside their own heads, a voice made of buzzing wings and rotting sweetness. It promised things no one else could see. It knew the shape of every fear, every hunger, every wound that had never healed. Confessions poured out like blood from a split throat. They didn't need the rack or the screws, the ropes, or the knives. Beelzebub's name oozed from trembling lips before the questions even finished, the taste of it sour and sweet, like meat gone bad. They spoke of the Sabbath, the feast, the kisses placed on the wrong mouths, the wrong flesh, the wrong gods. They spoke of Beelzebub's mark, the place on the skin where flies gathered even in winter, even in the dark, even after death. The women confessed to things they had never dreamed. Because Beelzebub whispered the shape of the story inside them, gave them words their mouths weren't meant to speak, made them believe the lies that had never been lies at all. The girl in the square stood too still. Her hair hung in tangled knots, flies crawling over the strands as though they had grown there with her. She didn't blink. She didn't cry. She just watched them with eyes too empty for a child, too full for a corpse. They burned her at dusk. The flames took her fast, but the buzzing stayed longer. The air hummed, the sound of wings thick and wet, as though the flies themselves had set her alight, their tiny bodies bursting into cinders that reeked of rotten honey. The priest said it was over. The magistrate declared the village clean. But no one opened their windows that night. Because they knew Beelzebub never left alone. The women who stood in the square the next morning found flies in their beds, in their hair, crawling from their mouths like the residue of a dream they could not remember. The men found rot in their wells, water thick and black, trembling with larvae that had no name. The witch hunts were never about witches. They were a feast laid out for Beelzebub, a table covered in fear and flesh and lies whispered through smoke. Every confession fed him. Every scream gave him voice. Every pyre lit the sky in his honor, the smoke rising like a prayer made of ash. And when the witches died, when the innocent died, they were not empty when they left. They carried him with them, beneath their tongues, behind their eyes. The ones who watched them burn heard the buzzing for days, weeks, years after the bodies were gone. Even now, in fields no one farms, in woods no one walks, the air hums. Low and steady, too faint to hear unless you stand very still, unless you hold your breath and wait. Beelzebub never needed to be summoned. He was already there. He is still there. And the flies always remember. The first crack split the silence like bones snapping beneath the heel of something too heavy to see, too holy to name. The sky itself, perfect, blinding, endless, ripped apart as if the fabric of creation could no longer hold what was coming. The air shook, not with thunder, but with the sound of wings tearing free from flesh, feathers scorched black in the very breath of God. Somewhere in that brilliant, endless light stood Beelzebub, his hands slick with the warmth of celestial blood, fingers trembling as if even he could not believe how easy it was to break what had never bled before. His mouth was still wet with God's name, the taste of it sharp, electric, a flavor too pure for a traitor's tongue. It had been a prayer once. Now it was a curse, a weapon sharpened on the edges of pride and longing. The first blow was not a scream, not a sword, not fire or fury. It was a single word, whispered in the darkness between the stars, a word older than time itself, the word that meant no. Lucifer spoke it first, but Beelzebub carried it in his heart long before sound ever dared to form. No. It burned through him like poison honey, sweet and ruinous, coating his tongue until every breath tasted of rebellion. No to the endless servitude. No to the perfect order. No to kneeling before light too blinding to be questioned. He was not the brightest. Not the first. Not the favorite. But Beelzebub was the loudest. His voice, a shriek of breaking wings and laughter stretched too thin, echoed across heaven's perfect plains, shattering the silence that held all things in place. When Lucifer raised his hand, Beelzebub stood beside him. His fingers were already curled into fists. His wings were already splitting at the seams, veins pulsing with something wild, something forbidden, the hunger to fall, to break free, to burn. The sky bled light. Not fire, not rain, light itself, pouring from the seams where angelic bodies split under the weight of choice. The ground beneath them, if it could be called ground, shuddered beneath the weight of war not yet begun but already promised. Beelzebub stood at the edge of heaven and spat into the light. It sizzled as it fell, the purity rejecting him like a body rejecting poison. But he had been inside it too long. It could not cast him out fast enough. He was not the first to fall, but he was the first to laugh. Lucifer's rage was a star collapsing, infinite and all-consuming. Beelzebub's was sharper, smaller, the needle hidden in the silk, the venom in the kiss, the maggot beneath the flesh. While others screamed in fury, he whispered, sweet and close, into the ears of those who trembled at the edge. It only takes one word to ruin paradise. One whisper to turn worship into doubt. When the first sword was raised, it was Beelzebub's hand that lifted it. When the first blow fell, it was his shadow that stretched beneath it, too wide, too long, covering more ground than any single angel should have. His wings had been gold once. Now they flickered, shadows crawling across the feathers like rot spreading beneath skin. Even the light that struck him seemed dimmer, as if heaven itself recoiled. He tasted war before it began. He tasted the ruin of what they were, the sweetness of breaking something perfect just to see if it would bleed. The angels who stood on the edge of war, those who trembled, those who could not yet choose, they felt his breath on their necks, warm and wet, a whisper of every doubt they had ever swallowed. Every secret they had buried beneath hymns. Every moment they had stared into the endless light and wondered what lay beyond it. He gave them that wonder. He gave them a hand to hold as they stepped into the dark. When Lucifer fell, Beelzebub was already falling. But he fell laughing. His voice, thin and sharp, slid between the cracks of heaven's walls, leaving stains that would never wash clean. Even in exile, he whispered back. The war did not end with the fall. It did not end at all. Because every prayer still reaches him, every trembling voice begging for mercy, for forgiveness, for freedom. They call to God, but Beelzebub listens. He knows the sound of a soul too afraid to rebel but too broken to obey. He knows the taste of doubt in holy mouths, the crack of light splitting into shadow inside hearts too weary to keep shining. He was not the first to rebel. But he was the first to teach rebellion how to whisper, how to slip beneath skin and bloom like rot in holy wood. The war against heaven was never fought with swords alone. It was fought in every breath held too long, every question swallowed down, every silent moment where worship tasted like fear. Beelzebub never left the battlefield. He is still there, just beneath the hymns, behind the light, his wings torn and his hands trembling, but his voice never faltered. It still hums in the bones of the faithful, a buzzing sound too faint to name, too sharp to ignore. The war against heaven never ended. Because Beelzebub never stopped whispering. The sound came first, a wet, low crack, like cartilage bending the wrong way beneath a weight too ancient to bear. It wasn't a scream, not yet. It was the prelude, the breath between the teeth, the throat choking down something too bitter to swallow. Beelzebub stood in the mouth of hell itself, where the air was too thick to breathe and too sharp to escape, where even shadows clung to the walls like they were afraid to move. And in that silence, where time forgot itself, the others were already waiting. The air shook when Leviathan stirred, a tremor so subtle it felt like a heartbeat beneath the ground, the pulse of something far too big to be contained within flesh or flame. Beelzebub could taste the salt on the air, thick and sour, like the breath of something that had swallowed oceans and spat them back out as poison. There were no words between them, not at first. Only the knowledge, cold and clear, that no two monsters could stand so close without one bleeding for the other. Leviathan's hunger was older than language, deeper than treason, a tide that swallowed light and spat out bones. Beelzebub knew that hunger. It crawled beneath his own skin, clawing at his ribs, gnawing at the edges of his tongue every time he spoke Lucifer's name. They were brothers, all of them, born from the same rebellion, the same hatred, the same wound where God's silence had split open and birthed something no holy light could contain. But brothers rot when left in the dark. And there was never enough hell to share. The first time Beelzebub felt Leviathan's teeth in his throat, it was not rage that burned him, it was joy. Because in the teeth, in the tearing, was proof that they were both still real, still fighting, still devouring each other piece by piece because that's all hell left them. There were no crowns here, only bones piled high enough to stand on. Somewhere beyond the tide of Leviathan's endless, rotting hunger came the soft, sin-sweet laughter of Asmodeus, a sound like silk stretched too thin over a blade. Every note dripped with honey and venom, every breath laced with the scent of sweat, blood, and want so thick it clung to the skin like fever. Asmodeus was not the strongest. Not the oldest. But he knew where to cut, where to slip his fingers between the ribs, where to whisper poison into the wounds Leviathan left behind. He never struck first, because he never needed to. Lust and war shared the same heartbeat, after all. And Beelzebub, with his hands still slick from ripping heaven open, was a feast laid bare before him. Beelzebub's hatred for Asmodeus was quiet, intimate, the kind of hatred you only feel for someone who's kissed you and left rot behind their tongue. They spoke in glances, in silence, in the space between claw and skin. And every time Beelzebub thought the silence might shatter, Asmodeus would smile, soft, cruel, patient, as if he already knew where the next crack would appear. But there was another. The weight, the stench, the filthy rot of gold too bright to be anything but a lie. Beelzebub felt Mammon before he saw him, the air thickening with the oily slickness of greed so absolute it made the stones beneath their feet sweat blood. Mammon was not a creature of hunger or lust. He was a wound that never closed, a hand that never released. Everything Beelzebub touched, Mammon wanted. Every kingdom, every soul, every fragment of power pried from the ribs of heaven, Mammon's fingers were already there, closing around it like rot crawling up bone. They never spoke. Words were too small, too human for what passed between them. Beelzebub's wings, torn and blackened, trembled every time Mammon drew close, not in fear, but in revulsion. Because Mammon never fought for glory, or hate, or the taste of blood. He fought because he couldn't bear to see someone else hold something he didn't own. The alliances were built from teeth and lies, forged in whispers and screams, broken as soon as they were made. One moment, Beelzebub stood at Leviathan's side, their shadows stretched into one. The next, his hands were in Leviathan's throat, fingers buried to the knuckle, feeling the endless cold flood from within. Asmodeus would press his lips to Beelzebub's ear, promises soft and wet, fingers tracing every old wound, every scar left by God, by hell, by the other princes who tore at him like vultures too greedy to wait for death. And always, Mammon watched. Silent. Patient. His hands closed tight, even when there was nothing left to hold but ash. They bled together, these princes of hell. They tore each other apart, piece by piece, not because they hated each other, but because it was the only way to remember what they once were. Beelzebub stood in the center of it all, the fly on the corpse, the rot in the heart, the voice that had whispered rebellion into the bones of heaven itself. He didn't need to be the strongest, the most feared, or the first. He only needed to survive. And survival meant war. There were no oaths between them, only moments, a hand at his back just before the blade fell, a shadow blocking the light for a single breath, a scream cut short because someone else took the blow. Alliances that lasted the length of a heartbeat, or the width of a knife, or the breath between curses. Every time Beelzebub stood beside one of them, he was already planning how to bury them. Every time he tore at their throats, he was already wondering if their bones would make a throne wide enough for him to sit upon. Hell was never a kingdom. It was a feast. And Beelzebub was the fly, buzzing at the edge, first to arrive, last to leave, his wings wet with blood, his mouth never full enough. The rivalries never ended. They pulsed beneath every word, every scream, every moment of silence stretched too tight between them. The princes tore at each other because hell was too small to hold them all, and the only way to taste power was through the throat of another. Leviathan's hunger. Asmodeus' touch. Mammon's greed. And Beelzebub, forever caught between them, the whisper that turned kings into corpses, the buzzing shadow that never stopped moving. There was no loyalty in hell. Only hunger, sharper than teeth, colder than Leviathan's tide, sweeter than Asmodeus' kiss, heavier than Mammon's gold. And Beelzebub. He was still hungry. The air itself hung thick and motionless, as though hell itself had stopped breathing. A single drop of black liquid rolled off the edge of a jagged stone table, splattering onto the cracked obsidian floor with a sound far too loud for something so small. It echoed like a gunshot across the chamber, and in that sound was a warning, a promise of the unspeakable. Every shadow seemed to pulse, stretching and twitching, feeding off the unseen tension curdling through the air. Beelzebub stood at the heart of it all, his eyes twin wounds of amber flame, his fingers resting lightly on the table's scorched surface, a touch so gentle it could have been mistaken for affection. But there was no affection here. Only hunger, only malice sharpened into something so precise it could slip beneath the skin without a sound. The council had been called, and hell answered, not with words, but with weight, with the crushing presence of beings too foul to be named without consequence. They came in shifting forms, scales curling into feathers, jaws melting into whispers, each one leaking some forgotten agony into the air until the room itself seemed to writhe. Beelzebub said nothing at first, only standing, only breathing, his mouth a scar stretched too tight. Every demon who gathered knew that silence was not stillness. It was strategy. It was calculation drawn so fine it sliced through time itself. His silence gnawed at them, at the edges of whatever soul still clung to their corrupted frames. They wanted him to speak. They feared what would happen when he did. The table was not just stone, it was made of choices, of betrayals stacked atop one another, held together by the sinew of promises broken before they were even spoken. Beelzebub's fingertips drifted across its surface, leaving trails of smoldering black, tiny flames that died as soon as they were born. The council knew what this meant. It was not for show. Each flicker was a temptation conceived, a scheme unfolded, a human life bent and broken into exquisite ruin. Every plan was a wound pressed into the skin of the world, and Beelzebub was the hand that guided the knife. The princes of hell circled the table's edge, their forms flickering, never still. Asmodeus, breath heavy with the scent of ruined flesh, leaned too close, his smile an obscene curve stretched across something too wet to be called skin. Leviathan curled in the shadows, a tide of limbs and teeth and endless, bottomless despair, his eyes the color of things drowned long ago. Mammon's fingers twitched, gold dripping from his claws like molten blood, his hunger endless, a void disguised as greed. They wanted Beelzebub to lead them, to carve the next path into the world above, but none of them would ask. To ask would be to surrender. And in this chamber, even surrender was a strategy. Beelzebub's voice, when it came, was soft. A sound that seemed to slip directly into the mind, curling around the base of the skull like smoke. It was not language, it was suggestion, the hint of things half seen through a cracked door. The human world, he said, was already theirs. Not through conquest, not through fire or screaming skies, but through the gentle hand pressed against a trembling back, guiding humanity one step at a time into their own ruin. They would want what was offered. They would beg for it. They would mistake their own chains for freedom and call it progress. Beelzebub's plans were never loud. They were whispered into the bones of the world itself, a suggestion so soft it felt like choice. His fingers curled into a fist, and with that single motion, the air trembled. New temptations took shape, not war, not bloodshed, but something quieter, something that slithered beneath the skin. A mother locking the door while her child cried on the other side, a man turning his back on a stranger drowning in the street, a prayer offered not to any god, but to the reflection in a screen. Each was so small, so ordinary, but each one was a doorway, a crack through which hell could slip its fingers. Beelzebub did not command armies. He did not shout orders across the battlefield. He whispered, and the world obeyed. Asmodeus snarled, the sound wet with hunger. He wanted more, always more, love twisted into obsession, bodies devoured in the dark, pleasure turned inside out until it curdled into pain. Leviathan seethed in silence, his tide pulling souls into depths too black for even the stars to penetrate. Mammon's fingers twitched again, dripping gold onto the table, gold that melted into something that screamed. They wanted chaos, they wanted ruin they could taste, they wanted the world to scream. Beelzebub offered them something worse, silence. The slow decay, the gentle fall, a world so sure it was safe that it never saw the knife at its throat. The council leaned closer, drawn to him despite themselves, despite the weight that pressed against their bones. They could smell it, the scent of every choice Beelzebub had ever offered, every soul he had ever lured with the promise of something just beyond their reach. They wanted to hate him, to tear him apart for his arrogance, for his silence, for the way he made them feel small. But they knew that without him, they were nothing but noise, chaos without direction, hunger without purpose. Beelzebub was the hand that shaped the darkness, the mind that gave the chaos meaning. He moved again, a single step, and the council shuddered. The stone beneath their feet wept black, the air thickened until it was impossible to breathe. One by one, the princes fell silent, their protests swallowed before they could be born. They would follow him, because they had no choice. Because his plans had already begun, because every breath they took was another step into his web. They would lash out, they would rage, they would tear themselves apart trying to find a way out, but there was no way out. Beelzebub did not lead. He did not command. He suggested, and they obeyed. Even when they thought they were rebelling, they were still dancing inside his hand. The air trembled again, softer this time, like the breath before a scream. Beelzebub turned, his eyes a promise, his smile a scar. The council watched him go, and none of them spoke. There were no orders given, no battle plans laid out, no declarations made. There was only silence, only the soft sound of footsteps fading into the dark, only the weight of knowing that the next move had already begun, and they were already part of it. They always had been. The air tastes wrong. Every breath, a gulp of iron and decay, as if the very atmosphere is bleeding. There's northwest wind in this place, no stirring of air or flicker of life. Everything is still, stretched tight like old skin pulled over bone, waiting to split. Silence rots here. It seeps into the mind, thick as tar, until thought itself feels like sin. Somewhere beneath the silence, faint and trembling, there's a sound. A tearing, a wet, relentless chewing, as though something vast and starving is feasting on the marrow of the world. The black emptiness splits, and there he is, Beelzebub, the Lord of Flies, the ruined prince, the carrion king, suspended within the frozen jaws of the ninth circle. His wings are still, broken sails torn from their mast, useless and thick with the frost of betrayal. His body, half flesh, half shadow, twists against the ice like a nerve caught in fire, but there's no escape, no salvation here. His face, if it can even be called that, is a mask of hunger, wide mouth stretched too far, sagging under the weight of the souls he consumes. He does not scream. The condemned do that for him. They rise from the ice, half-formed, their faces frozen in the moment of their final, shattered breath. Their hands, so pale they glow, claw toward the edges of his mouth. They beg, not for freedom, not for life, but to be devoured whole and gone, to escape the silence with the violent mercy of his teeth. But Beelzebub is slow. He drags it out, savoring every sliver of their fear, grinding it down into something bitter and eternal. Their pain becomes part of him, fused into the tissue of his tongue, the pulp of his gums. He feeds and he is never full. Dante and Virgil stand at the edge, brittle souls trembling in the shadow of that monstrous hunger. There is no courage here, only the brittle shell of it, thin enough to snap beneath the weight of his gaze. He does not see them the way a predator sees prey. He sees them the way the ocean sees a single drop of blood, distant and irrelevant until it spreads. Beelzebub's eyes are the oldest wound in creation. They do not blink. They do not flinch. They only stare, blind and endless, into the heart of the universe itself. And somewhere in that vast, empty stare, there's a flicker, a memory of heaven, of golden halls and music too pure for mortal ears. It's a memory that curdles the moment it touches him, turning rancid with hate and self-loathing so potent it burns. He was not always this. Once, his wings stretched wide enough to hold the dawn. Once, he sang until creation itself paused to listen. But now, all that remains is hunger. His hands, jagged and blackened like the roots of a dead tree, are fused to the ice. Each finger digs into the flesh of the earth itself, not to escape, but to hold himself down. There is nowhere to go. Heaven will not have him. Hell is already his kingdom. The only thing left is the endless scream inside his own mind, the one voice even the damned cannot hear, the one that whispers his true name, Baal, Belial, Beelzebub, the names rot together into a single, venomous breath. Flies coat him, writhing beneath the frozen glaze on his skin, their wings crushed against the ice. They pulse like a second heart, a mass of tiny, buzzing sins too small to see but too loud to ignore. Every fly is a voice, every voice a temptation whispered into the ear of a dying man. They are his choir now, his only music, the buzzing hum of broken promises and rotting prayers. Virgil's voice is a thin thread against the weight of Beelzebub's silence, guiding Dante forward, step by trembling step. They walk past his face, past his mouth, past the eternal chew and grind of souls reduced to pulp. They walk beneath the ruined arch of his wings, the bones visible through the thin, torn membrane. The ice clings to the edges of those wings, trapping him halfway between flight and ruin, forever suspended in the moment of his fall. The air grows colder the closer they come, cold not like winter, but like the touch of something ancient, something older than sin itself. It is the cold of creation's first breath, the shuddering gasp of a world waking into emptiness. Beelzebub does not move, does not breathe, but the cold pours from him, a living thing, wrapping around the ankles of the living, slowing their pulse, dulling their senses. Every step feels heavier. Every heartbeat echoes through the silence, a hollow drumbeat counting down to something no one dares name. Dante wants to speak, but the words die in his throat. There is no language for what Beelzebub is, no word for the smell of frozen blood, no sound for the hush that falls when God turns his face away. There is only the slow, grinding horror of his endless feast, the way his teeth crack bone into splinters, the way his tongue searches the cracks for one last taste of suffering. And then the eyes shift. For the briefest second, Beelzebub sees them. Not the way a man sees a stranger, not even the way a beast sees prey. He sees them the way a nightmare sees a sleeping child, the way hunger sees the faintest flicker of light at the bottom of the abyss. There is no recognition. There is no malice. There is only the fact of them, the unbearable reality that they are here, warm and alive, within reach. The silence fractures. The ice cracks, hairline fractures racing outward from his mouth, and the air itself begins to hum. Not music. Not speech. Just the sound of endless hunger, ancient and endless, a need so pure it has no name, no face, no shape. Beelzebub shifts, the tiniest motion, one shattered wing lifting half an inch from the ice, just enough to let the flies beneath it breathe. Dante cannot move. His breath locks in his chest, his heart slams against his ribs, trying to flee his body. Every inch of him begs to run, to turn back, to do anything but stand in the shadow of the starving king. But Virgil's hand is on his shoulder, and there is no turning back. There is only forward, only downward, past the jaws of the ruined prince, past the hunger that will never die, past the silence that watches them go. The flies take flight, a cloud of blackness rising from the ice, and Beelzebub's mouth opens wider. The sound that follows is not a scream, not a roar, but something lower, deeper, a sound so ancient it has no name, only a weight, a pressure that crushes everything beneath it. Dante walks on. Beelzebub watches, hunger trailing after them like a shadow, forever gnawing at their heels. A silence so thick it felt like the breath of a corpse clung to the scorched air, and there, standing on the fractured edge of hell's blackened throne, stood Beelzebub, his face carved from something colder than stone, sharper than bone, darker than any shadow that ever lived. His lips never moved, but the weight of his presence folded over the burning sky, pressing down until even the flames flickered weak with fear. Satan stood beside him, but there was no mistaking who held the map to damnation in the palm of his hand. The silence didn't break, it was torn apart. Beelzebub's voice slipped into the air, oily and slow, curling around the throats of every damned soul that dared to listen. Words born from the pits of his mind, words sharp enough to cut through agony itself, guiding Satan's fury like a blade aimed at the throat of creation. His voice didn't shout, didn't rage, it whispered, and that whisper was more terrifying than any scream hell could birth. The ground beneath his feet cracked open, swallowing molten stone and bones ground into dust, but Beelzebub stood still, his fingers tracing invisible lines in the smoke, charting war across the heavens. His eyes, if they were still eyes, held no light, no hunger, no glee, only the weight of thought so vast it drowned itself in silence. He was not the storm. He was the architect of the storm, the hand that carved the path through ruin, the mind that made every scream a melody, every drop of blood a calculated move. Even Satan, prince of rebellion, stood in the gravity of that presence. Not as a servant, no, but as something worse. A man clinging to a torch while the architect of infernos stood beside him, smiling without lips, breathing without lungs, seeing without eyes. Beelzebub was not born to follow. He was the strategist, the breath behind every plot, the silent hand that molded rebellion into war, war into suffering, suffering into purpose. And purpose, oh, purpose was Beelzebub's only love. He didn't move, not with the frantic energy of those desperate to rise, but with the patience of something ancient and certain, something that knew how the sky would shatter long before the first stone was cast. Every word that left his mouth was a nail in the coffin of heaven, each syllable a blueprint for ruin so complete, so precise, it felt less like betrayal and more like fate carving itself into the bones of the universe. The other fallen gathered like vultures, circling the edges of his silence, their wings trembling with the need for blood, for vengeance, for purpose in the ruin they now called home. They shouted, they roared, they swore themselves to war, but Beelzebub stood silent, his fingers still tracing invisible patterns in the air, each movement another fracture in the foundation of hope itself. Satan burned with fury, raw and wild, a bonfire screaming into the night. Beelzebub was colder than the void between the stars, a blade honed so fine it could slip through flesh without a whisper. One moved with rage. The other with inevitability. Together, they were ruin and purpose, chaos and calculation, the scream and the silence that followed. There were no doubts in Beelzebub's mind, no flicker of hesitation, no shadow of regret. He had seen the war before it began, tasted the blood before it spilled, stood in the ashes before the first spark was struck. When he spoke, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, afraid to interrupt the architect at work. His plans were not wild acts of rebellion, they were stories told in reverse, fate's wound backward from ending to beginning, each step a masterpiece of suffering. Even Satan, with all his brilliance, was a blade Beelzebub held in his hand, a blade he knew how to wield, how to sharpen, how to break if the need ever arose. Beelzebub's loyalty was not born from worship, nor from fear. It was something far colder. He saw what could be built from ruin, and he knew his hands were the only ones steady enough to build it. He spoke of war not like a tyrant, not like a beast, but like a sculptor describing the final stroke before the marble split open to reveal something terrible and holy beneath. His words were not sermons, they were measurements, calculations, the precise weight of suffering needed to crack the gates of heaven itself. The fallen clung to his words, not because they trusted him, but because they could feel the truth beneath them, like a corpse feeling the nails hammering into its coffin. There was no question. There was no hesitation. Beelzebub spoke, and the world bent to accommodate his voice. Every suggestion was a scalpel, every strategy a knife sliding between heaven's ribs, every silence a breath held just long enough to choke the life from hope itself. He painted the future in blood and ash, but with the precision of an artist who knew exactly where every drop must fall. And when the silence returned, when his voice slipped back into the dark, there was no applause, no roar of approval, only the tremble of wings, the hush of breathing, the weight of inevitability crashing down on every damned soul. They didn't follow because they believed. They followed because they could already feel the chains of his plan tightening around their throats, pulling them forward into a war they could neither escape nor understand. Beelzebub stood beside Satan, not as an equal, not as a servant, but as the shadow behind the crown, the voice behind the roar, the hand that moved the blade even as it rested in Satan's grip. There was no rebellion without him, no war without his map, no ruin without his hand to guide it. Every step was a whisper in his mind long before it echoed in the shattered halls of hell. He didn't need to command. He didn't need to shout. His silence was a language carved into the bones of every fallen angel, a story they all knew but could never speak aloud. His was the mind that made hell possible, the breath that turned chaos into purpose, the whisper that shaped rebellion into something more terrifying than war itself. And still, he stood, fingers tracing invisible lines in the air, mapping ruin upon ruin, suffering upon suffering, until there was nothing left but silence, and even that silence belonged to him. There was no end to his work. No pause. No hesitation. Only the cold certainty of a mind that saw the fall of heaven as the first step, not the last. Beelzebub was not the king. He was the architect. And the war had only just begun. The candle flickered once, then failed entirely. The room swallowed itself in a cold, unnatural dark. Not the gentle absence of light, but the kind of shadow that knew it was being watched, that leaned closer, pressing its weight against every surface, until the walls, the floor, the air itself ached under its touch. It wasn't silence that followed, but something worse, a soundlessness so sharp it rang in the bones, a silence that wasn't empty, but crowded with unseen teeth, unseen eyes. Somewhere in that choking hush, Beelzebub smiled. His breath slid across the back of Faust's neck, slick with something that felt too close to hunger and too far from warmth. The pact had already been made, inked not with blood, but with the trembling marrow of a soul unraveling under the weight of its own desire. Beelzebub was not the trickster, not the whispering tempter behind Mephistopheles' lips, he was the architect beneath the floorboards, the rod in the beams, the architect of every crack in Faust's longing. His voice came first, and it wasn't words that broke the silence, but the feeling of them, like fingers sliding beneath skin, pulling it loose from muscle, peeling the safety away. All that you crave, all that you are, it was never yours. The words crawled, shivering through the air, wrapping themselves around Faust's throat. It was always me. Beelzebub did not hover. He poured himself into the cracks of the room, his presence slithering through the grain of the wood, the dying light in Faust's eyes. Every corner he touched bent toward him, the furniture warped, the ceiling seemed lower, the air thinner. Nothing screamed, but everything wanted to. The temptation had never been gentle. It had never been sweet whispers in dark corners or forbidden fruits dangled just out of reach. It was hunger made flesh, desire sharpened to a point, a hook driven deep into Faust's chest. It was the promise that there could be more, always more, if only he would let go of the last brittle shard of what made him human. The ground shifted under his feet, not physically, but in the sense that direction itself became uncertain. The laws of the world, up, down, safety, danger, collapsed like rotting beams under the weight of Beelzebub's presence. Faust's mind stretched thin, trembling between terror and longing, unable to choose which way to fall. Beelzebub did not promise beauty. He did not promise love or glory. His voice was not a lure, but a blade. "You think you sold your soul for knowledge," he whispered, with the kind of smile that could gut a man. But knowledge was only the key to the door. It's what stands behind the door that owns you now. His laughter was not sound. It was the sensation of something vital being pulled away, something soft, something hidden in the hollows of the chest. Faust could feel it leave him, feel the space it left behind. And into that space, Beelzebub poured himself. Not all at once. a drop at a time. Slow, cold, inevitable. Faust's heartbeat was the only sound left, a thin, frantic rhythm, each beat a question, each silence between them an answer. He wanted to run, but there was nowhere Beelzebub was not. He wanted to fight, but Beelzebub had already touched him, already threaded himself through Faust's veins, already stood where his shadow should be. The walls shuddered, not from movement, but from the weight of understanding settling over them. This was no devil at the door, no demon making a deal in the dark. This was rot in the foundation, this was the weight of the world pressing down on the fragile bones of a man who thought he could bargain with hunger itself. He knew the shape of him, knew the curve of his smile, the sharpness of his fingers, the hunger that was not content to simply devour, but to hollow out and wear the skin it left behind. Every step Faust took, Beelzebub had already walked it. Every thought Faust had, Beelzebub had already whispered it into the marrow of his bones. There was no Faust without him, no line where one ended and the other began. Beelzebub was not outside, not beyond. He was within. And yet, Faust still reached for something. Some splinter of himself, some memory that had not yet rotted under Beelzebub's touch. A child's voice, a sunrise not yet corrupted by longing, the shape of a hand that once held his without demand. For a heartbeat, something almost human flickered in his chest. Beelzebub's laugh shattered it. "You were never meant to be free," Beelzebub whispered, and his words were hands closing around Faust's throat. "You were only meant to want." The room buckled, not from heat, not from force, but from the sheer weight of knowing. This was not damnation. This was not punishment. This was inevitability. This was Beelzebub standing in the center of Faust's heart and finding it already empty, already waiting for him. The contract had never been written. It had been carved, long before Faust knew words, long before Faust had a name. The hunger was not planted, it was born there, a seed nestled between his ribs, fed with every desperate hope, every silent prayer. Beelzebub did not have to tempt him. He only had to wait. And now there was no waiting left. The air itself leaned closer, heavy with the weight of Beelzebub's breath. Faust's hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of holding nothing. Every hope had been stripped clean, every dream worn thin, until there was nothing left but the hunger, and Beelzebub, grinning wide enough to swallow it whole. Faust opened his mouth, not to scream, not to beg, but to breathe, and Beelzebub's breath was already there, filling his lungs, twisting around his tongue, stealing the last words from his throat before they could be born. There was no scream. There was no silence. There was only Beelzebub, and the door, and the endless hunger beyond. The candle flickered, though no breath stirred the air. Wax bled down its side like a wound that refused to clot. The table shook faintly, just once, and the ancient leather binding of the book seemed to twitch as if something within had gasped awake. Fingers hovered above the cover, trembling, torn between the primal urge to flee and the darker compulsion to know. There was no voice, no whisper, but something older than language crept through the silence, curling through the gaps in the stone walls, slithering under the door, soaking into the floorboards like invisible rot. The lesser key of Solomon had been opened before, countless hands staining its pages, but tonight, it hungered for fresh flesh. The first page didn't simply lie there, it pulsed, like it was stitched to some unseen heart. Beelzebub. The name wasn't printed, it was branded into the paper, each letter a scar, each syllable a bite. It was more than ink. It stank of ancient ash, of blood boiled dry, of a million prayers screamed into the void and left unanswered. The room dimmed, not with shadow, but with something thicker, something sentient, pressing against the skin, against the soul, 1,000 invisible fingers prying at every weakness. They had written his name in ink, but ink was never enough to hold him. His presence burned through every word, twisting even the margins into something hungry, something waiting. Beelzebub wasn't just a prince among demons. He was the weight in the air before a scream, the taste of copper on a bitten tongue, the shape you see in the corner of your eye when you know no one's there. His name hummed through the grimoire's brittle spine, low and constant, like something far away gnawing at the edges of the world, growing closer with every breath. They called him Lord of the Flies, but no fly could carry the sickness that dripped from his tongue. The flies were merely shadows of his passing, hollow husks left behind after he had already devoured the heart of whatever he touched. The Ars Goetia listed him with authority, a name in a cold catalogue, but that was a lie the living told themselves to sleep easier. No book could contain him. No ink could silence him. Beelzebub was not summoned, he arrived, like rot blooming in a wound left too long unattended, like the bitter taste of betrayal the moment before the knife slides home. The grimoire didn't guide hands to control him. It seduced them, whispering that control was possible, that with the right sigil, the right invocation, the right mutilation of the soul, Beelzebub could be bound. But those pages bled with the arrogance of the dead, the same dead who thought their circles and chants could tame the tide. The ink knew better. It knew those seals weren't locks, they were invitations. Every ward, every precaution, every trembling syllable was nothing more than knocking at his door. And when Beelzebub answers, he does not open the door. He pulls you through it. The Ars Goetia detailed the offerings, but it never spoke of the price. Not directly. Those who had tried to write it down found their ink running dry, their hands cramping until the bones snapped beneath the skin. There are some costs the living mind cannot name without breaking. Beelzebub's presence wasn't currency. It was infection. It slipped beneath the skin, nested in the bones, whispered in the heart's quietest moments. There was no haggling, no bargaining. There was only consumption, slow or sudden, gentle or brutal, but always complete. The grimoire pages crackled when turned, too dry, too brittle, too eager to crumble into dust. But the words would not die with the paper. They lingered, drifting in the air like spores, finding every wound, every weak seam in the soul and sinking in, planting themselves, waiting. Beelzebub's name was a seed, and no matter how deeply it was buried, it always bloomed. Even those who turned away after reading it, who swore to never speak it aloud, could hear it later, soft at first, like the scrape of distant footsteps in an empty hall. Then louder, until it filled the silence between heartbeats, until it stood behind their reflection in every darkened window, until it was all they knew. There were no instructions for ending it. Northwest right to close the door once opened. The Lesser Key of Solomon had no final page because Beelzebub had no end. His hunger was older than the ink, older than the paper, older than the trembling hands that first dared to name him. He was the silence before language, the scream trapped behind centuries of superstition and prayer. His title meant nothing. His power needed no crown. He was not a prince, not a lord, not a king, he was the gnawing emptiness that feasts on every kingdom, every soul, every trembling hope foolish enough to believe it could stand against him. The authors had tried to give him shape. A monstrous fly, a bloated corpse with a mouth too wide, a shadow with too many arms. But those were gifts given by mortal fear, not his true face. Beelzebub had no face. He wore the faces of those who called him, each one twisted just enough to remind them what they had lost. He spoke with their own voices, turned sharp and hollow, feeding back every whispered doubt, every buried betrayal. His presence was not arrival, it was realization, the sudden knowledge that the voice whispering in the dark was never a stranger. It was always him. Always waiting. Always inside. The Lesser Key was only a doorway. The demon stared back at him from the canvas, no longer. In the centuries that followed, others would paint him too, though none with hands as raw and skin as stretched thin over bones as the first. Beelzebub appeared in manuscripts that priests refused to touch barehanded, their fingertips hovering just above the surface as though afraid the ink itself could cling and burrow into flesh. In the cramped margins of psalters and the illuminated corners of prayer books, his form flickered, a pig-faced abomination gnawing the souls of the damned, a fly-headed monstrosity bloated with corruption, wings dripping with the slime of things birthed in darkness too ancient to name. The faces changed, but the eyes never did. Every artist, whether monk or heretic, ended up painting the same eyes. Lidless. Watching. Hungry. In one fresco, Beelzebub's mouth stretched so wide it split his face in two, unhinged like a snake poised to swallow the sky. The monks who worked the scaffolding said they could hear it, the slow crack of painted bone, the wet suction as the jaw sagged further each night. No one painted it, they swore. They had drawn the face, yes, but the mouth had grown by itself, inch by inch, until one morning they found it stretched from the keystone at the ceiling's peak down to the floor where the abbey's dead were buried. The fresco was bricked over, but no mortar was thick enough to silence the sound. In stained glass, Beelzebub's wings were never still. Caught in shifting sunlight, they quivered, each vein pulsing with molten light, each membrane stretched thin enough to show the bones inside. The glaziers who worked the panels left prayers scratched into the lead framing, pleas for their souls if the glass ever shattered. The glass always shattered. Storms were blamed. War was blamed. Never the thing in the glass itself, never the thing that had stared down at the congregations, mouths gone dry mid-prayer, unable to tear their eyes away. The tapestries were worse. Threads wound so tight they cut fingers to the bone, every stitch a whispered plea to something that never answered. Beelzebub's image twisted through the fabric like a serpent coiling under skin, faces hidden in the folds of his wings, hands reaching from the shadows between his ribs. The weavers knew. They always knew. They burned their hands with candle wax, hoping pain would drown the whispers before they stitched them into the weft. It never worked. The faces in the tapestry watched them from the moment the first thread met the loom. In one cathedral, his form was carved into the choir stalls, so subtle you wouldn't see him unless the light struck just right. The legs of flies curled around the edges of the wood, forming filigree patterns that only made sense when you stared too long. If you sat there, long enough for the wood to warm beneath your palms, you'd feel the ridges under your fingers shift, the fly legs flexing, pressing back against your skin. The wood was warmest where his eyes were hidden, buried just below the varnish. The artists were never remembered. Their names vanished, lost in ledgers that crumbled to dust, their faces blurred in sketches that turned to smears. But Beelzebub endured. His face slithered from canvas to wall, from vellum to stone, from fabric to glass, always changing, always the same. Each generation believed they were the first to capture him, but they were only tracing what had already been drawn in wrought and fire centuries before. They weren't creators. They were conduits. The Renaissance brought finer tools, richer pigments, but the subject remained the same. Beelzebub stepped into the light, no longer crouched in the margins but standing full-bodied in altarpieces, his wings stretched wide, his belly distended with devoured souls. His feet, cracked and blistered from treading over fields salted with the bones of heretics, stood planted firm in scenes of torment so vivid you could almost hear the screams bleed from the wood. The artists were braver then, or more foolish. They painted him with human faces, human hands, human eyes. That was the mistake. They thought they were reducing him, making him something they could understand. But the human face was a mask he was waiting to wear. The human eyes, his way in. The more human they made him, the closer he came, until the face they painted was no longer his, but theirs, twisted and split open from within. One artist, young, brilliant, burning with ambition, painted Beelzebub into the background of a masterpiece meant to hang in a palace chapel. The demon's face was hidden in clouds, his hands curling around the edges of the scene like smoke rising from a distant fire. The artist's name is lost, erased not by time but by design. No one speaks of him, not because they forgot, but because they remember too well. They remember what happened when the painting was unveiled, how the sky split open, how the ground beneath the chapel quaked, how the artist stood in front of his work, eyes wide and mouth stretched in a scream that never ended. The painting was burned. The chapel was sealed. The artist was dragged from the room, but his scream stayed. It never left. Some say it still lingers, folded into the air like smoke, too thin to hear unless you're alone, unless you stand too close to the wall where the painting once hung. Beelzebub is not a name. Not a being. He is a stain that spreads through pigment and prayer, through thread and glass, through skin and breath. Every hand that dares to render him pulls him closer, every eye that stares too long becomes his own. He was never just in the art. He is in the hands that create it. In the eyes that witness it. In the silence between brushstrokes. And even now, even as you read this, his fingers are curling around the edges of your mind, tracing their way toward the center where fear is sweetest, where your soul is softest, where your reflection is waiting to split open and let him in. The wind dies without warning, snuffed out like a breath held too long, leaving the night too still, too thick, too aware. The flames in the village hearth seem to lean back, recoiling, as if something they cannot touch crawls through the air, bending the weight of the world around it. The storyteller's voice breaks through the silence, not loud, not urgent, but low and unsteady, every word trembling on the edge of a scream that cannot find its way out. Beelzebub. The name scratches across the wooden beams like a fingernail dragged over bone, a sound not meant for living ears, but there it is, spilling out into the hush. Mothers clutch their children closer. The old men shift in their chairs, hands tightening around their worn pipes, knowing they've heard it before, though none will admit when. The name doesn't belong here, they all know that, but somehow it always finds its way in, crawling through cracks in the stories they thought were safe. He was in the barn once, they say, his breath wet and rotting in the hay. A farmer woke to the sound of his horse screaming, but when he staggered out with a lantern, the beast was fine, silent, wide-eyed, trembling, but untouched. It was the farmer himself who found the hoofprints, burned into the dirt, running in circles until they stopped at his own bare feet. No one saw Beelzebub that night. They never do. They only smell him, feel the heat pressing on their skin, a breath too close without a mouth to deliver it. In a village further north, they whisper of the house on the hill, the one no carpenter could repair. The boards rot too fast, the nails turn red and weep rust, and every door swells shut no matter how wide it's thrown open. A family tried to live there once. The children lasted 3 days. The mother's hair went white in a week. The father hung himself before the end of the month, his mouth stretched into a grin no one could pry away, no matter how hard they pushed his lips together. It was Beelzebub, they said. Not because they saw him, but because of the flies. They crawled from the cracks in the windows, black bodies too fat, too slick, pressing against the glass until it split into veins of broken light. They covered the ceiling in a pulsing skin of wings, buzzing so loud the children's screams couldn't rise above it. They found the mother in the cellar, hands pressed over her ears so tightly her nails dug into her skull. She wasn't crying. She wasn't breathing. Her lips mouthed one word over and over, silent, broken, worshipful. Beelzebub. The stories come in different shapes, but they all taste the same, like dirt, blood, and the metallic tang of something burning where nothing should. In the markets of Damascus, they speak of the beggar with no eyes, sitting cross-legged beneath the gate, his hands always reaching but never quite touching. He hums a melody no one knows, but everyone remembers, a melody that worms into the spine, curling like smoke, making it impossible to sleep without hearing it again. They say Beelzebub whispers it to him each dawn, his voice no louder than a dying breath, promising that if the song ever stops, the blind man's skin will peel away like paper in fire, and the flies will feast on the meat beneath. In the stone alleys of Prague, they tell of the scholar who wrote Beelzebub's true name in ink mixed with his own blood. The letters twisted as soon as they touched the parchment, rearranging themselves into symbols no human mind could hold. He saw them shift, saw them crawl, felt them burrow into the soft tissue behind his eyes until every breath tasted of rot and every shadow stretched too long. The ink never dried. It slithered down his fingers like oil, black and wet and hungry, until there was nothing left but bones and paper and the faint echo of a man begging for something no one could grant. The children of rural France know the story of the miller's son, who thought it was clever to mock the demon's name beneath the harvest moon. He carved it into the bark of the oldest oak, laughing at the old women who crossed themselves and spat to ward off the curse. That night, the moon split into 3 jagged pieces, and the river ran backwards, dragging fish up onto the banks to rot in the grass. They found the miller's son in the morning, naked, blind, and shivering, his skin covered in the prints of 1,000 tiny feet. He never spoke again. He never blinked. But his lips were always moving, chewing at empty air, whispering a name no one dared speak. Beelzebub. In the deserts where sand shifts like living things, traders speak of the time the flies came in clouds so thick they blacked out the sun. They weren't ordinary flies. Their wings were too thin, their eyes too bright, and their hum was almost, music. They crawled into tents, into mouths, into nostrils, filling every space until men clawed at their own skin to make more room. When the wind shifted, they were gone, leaving nothing behind but bones clean to a polish, and in the sand, a message written in no language spoken by human tongues. In the forests where no path stays true, they whisper about the faceless hunter who walks without sound, always 3 steps behind. They say his breath is hot enough to blister bark and his fingers leave tracks like maggots in flesh. Those who see him never see his face, only the flies that hang in the air around him, turning in perfect spirals, forming shapes no one dares describe. They say Beelzebub hunts through him now, wears him like skin, and when the hunter sleeps, the flies slip beneath his eyelids and whisper stories that make him scream until his throat runs dry. There's no one story that holds him. No single shape can contain him. Beelzebub slips through tongues like oil, changing with the language, with the fears that birth him. In some places, he is the Lord of Rot, the king who sits atop a throne made from the bones of starved dogs, his crown buzzing with black wings. In others, he is a shadow with no limbs, a presence that coils in the space between heartbeat and breath, waiting for silence long enough to speak. But in all the tales, whether whispered under desert stars or carved into the stone walls of half-forgotten chapels, there's one thing that never changes. Beelzebub is always there before the story begins, watching from the corner where the firelight doesn't reach. And he is always there after, when the voices fall silent and the flies gather at the windows, waiting for the next name to call him home. The screen flickers, black swallowing the light until only a sliver remains, a crack, a breath, a whispered invitation through a monitor's dying glow. Static crawls from the speakers, not random noise, but a voice hidden beneath layers of distortion, scraping like nails across raw metal. A voice that shouldn't be there. A voice that doesn't belong to the game. Your fingers hover above the keyboard, cold sweat slick against plastic keys, your pulse stammering, unsure if it should race or stop altogether. The name flashes across the screen, not the character you chose, not the name you typed, but something older, something that slipped from pages into code, from ink into pixels. Beelzebub. The name lands with a weight that folds the air around you, crushing the silence, suffocating the illusion of fiction. He's here, between the frames, curled inside the loading screens, crawling through the text boxes where no code should breathe. The game stutters, trembles, the edges fraying into something obscene, something alive. The developers didn't put him there. He put himself there. There's no patch, no update, no mod to blame. This is older than software, older than stories, a crawling rut that wears the mask of entertainment but tastes of centuries-old blood. In the darkness, across the history of screens, he's been waiting, pressing his face against the thin walls separating fantasy from hunger, from flesh. The books knew him first, ink bleeding into skin, every page a doorway cracked just wide enough to let the flies slip through. In books, he spoke through priests gone mad, through heroes who stood too close to the edge of their own sanity, through the mouths of children who screamed prophecies they could never understand. The authors swore they were writing fiction, but their hands shook, their nights swarmed with buzzing they couldn't silence, no matter how far they fled from the page. Beelzebub didn't care for their protests, their feeble denials. He only cared that their fingers kept moving, that their nightmares never emptied, that the ink always flowed. One by one, their books slipped into the world, masked as horror, as fantasy, as allegory, but the name, his name, always survived, always found new tongues to whisper it. The words weren't enough. Not forever. Ink dried. Pages crumbled. Fire devoured libraries but couldn't burn him away. So he slid into film, into screens flickering in dark theaters, faces lit by images they thought were stories but were, in truth, summonings. Every jump scare, every demonic monologue, every moment where the air turned too thick and the shadows moved without cause, all of it was him. A finger tracing the edges of the screen, reminding the audience they were never alone. Directors didn't know they were filming him. Actors didn't know they were breathing him in between takes, shivering from a cold that settled too close to their spines, curling around their ribs like a second set of hands. But the cameras knew. The film itself knew. The lights flickered, scenes stretched too long or cut too short, dialogue twisted in mouths until words soured into something that tasted of rot and dirt. His name flickered past the credits, never listed, but always there. The audience went home, but they took him with them. They heard him in the hum of televisions long after they powered down, in the broken language of corrupted tapes, in the static that followed them from screen to silence. Beelzebub wasn't just content to haunt the media, he wanted hands. He wanted bodies. He wanted 1,000 million eyes watching him, blinking him into existence with every terrified breath. Then came the games. The games didn't need him to wait. They invited him. They begged him. Players, desperate to touch something darker than their own boredom, built worlds for him. They coded him into secrets, into Easter eggs, into rituals layered beneath pixels and polygons, hidden just out of reach until someone was desperate enough to break the rules. Cheat codes turned to chance. Glitches turned to gateways. Boss fights turned to bargains no player could ever win. Every screen was a shrine. Every death screen a prayer to something that lived between the frames, just waiting for the right words, the right fear, the right crack in the player's mind to split wide enough for him to slip through. They said his name without knowing. They thought they were playing. They thought they were safe. They thought wrong. Beelzebub doesn't need an altar anymore. Not in a world where screens outnumber souls. Every phone, every console, every backlit device is a whispering throat, calling him through glass and wire. The line between horror and reality never existed for him. He was always both. Always there. Always hungry. His face changes with every adaptation. Some stories make him grotesque, bloated with flies and filth, his belly distended with rot and gluttony. Others drape him in charm, slick with charisma, a smile too wide, a voice too soft, too knowing. The games and movies twist him into countless forms, a lord of flies, a corrupter of minds, a tempter, a monster, a shadow with too many eyes. None of them are wrong. None of them are right. They're all just fragments of the same crawling truth. He doesn't need to choose a shape. He doesn't need to choose a story. As long as you're watching, as long as you're reading, as long as you're playing, he's there. Behind your reflection in the dark screen after you shut it off. In the buzzing of your headset when the game lags at the worst possible moment. In the whispered lines of dialogue no developer wrote, no actor ever spoke, but you swear you heard, soft, low, ancient. You never needed to believe in him. That was never the requirement. You only needed to see him. And you did. You have. And now you can't stop. Because Beelzebub doesn't live in hell anymore. He lives in the pause screen. In the corrupted save file. In the horror novel left half-finished on your nightstand because you couldn't take one more chapter. In the horror movie you muted because the silence felt safer. He doesn't care if you call him a legend. Or a trope. Or a metaphor for something bigger, something less supernatural, something easier to explain. Those are all just excuses to keep reading, to keep watching, to keep playing. To keep feeding him. The screen flickers again. The silence isn't empty anymore. Something hums through the speakers, soft, distorted, ancient. His name. His name. His name. And now you know. He's been watching you this whole time. Keep playing. The knife hung in the air, trembling between shadow and candlelight, its blade slick with something too dark to be blood, too thick to be water. A tremor passed through the room, a breathless ripple, as if the walls themselves inhaled. The chanting had stopped minutes ago, but its echo lingered, a ghost of sound slithering along the floor, curling around the ankles of the robed figures who stood in a perfect circle, their hands still sticky with what they'd offered. No one moved. No one dared. The silence held the weight of something watching. The floor reeked of burned herbs, metallic tang, sweat-slick fear. Smoke bled from the symbols carved into the wood, their edges still raw and oozing. In the center stood a bowl, ancient, cracked down the middle like a skull split wide, filled with writhing shapes no eyes could fully understand. The air grew heavier, pressing into ribs and skin, a humid, invisible force that tasted like rot and distant screams. One word had been spoken. Not a name, but a summons, a vibration that clawed its way up their throats and into the night. It left something behind. Something hungry. Beelzebub. No one knew how long it would take, or if it would happen at all. But they'd felt him the moment the first drop hit the floor. It was never sudden. No blinding flash, no grand arrival. Just a shift, like the room itself was no longer in this world, pulled through a tear into something older, something that remembered the taste of burned skin and shattered faith. The candle flames leaned toward the center, stretching like hands desperate to touch something they couldn't hold. The shadows twisted with them, writhing up the walls, moving too fast, too alive. Faces formed, then broke apart. Eyes, too many, too bright, opened for a heartbeat, then vanished into the void that had come to sit among them. One of them began to shake, teeth rattling inside a clenched jaw, a single bead of sweat rolling down his temple like a tear. He had no name here. None of them did. Names were left outside the circle, burned away before the ritual began, reduced to ash and silence. They were vessels now, meat and bone and prayer stitched together with trembling will. The air hummed, not a sound, but a vibration that settled beneath the skin, made teeth ache and hearts stutter. It moved through them, a breath they couldn't take, a whisper they couldn't silence. It tasted of copper and filth, of rot left too long in the sun. It was him. Not fully. Not yet. But a sliver, a fingernail dragged across the veil, peeling it back until something older than God could peer through. Beelzebub. There was no shape to him. No form. He was hunger wrapped in shadow, a feast of gnawing mouths and shattered wings. He slipped between them, brushing against their flesh without touching, leaving them colder, emptier. Their breath fogged the air, every exhale stolen by the presence circling them like a predator too patient for haste. One candle snuffed itself out, the wick curling into smoke, and in the instant the flame died, something stood in its place. Not human. Not even close. The legs were wrong, bending backwards at the knee, hooves digging into the wood with a sound like wet bones snapping. Flies, dozens, hundreds, burst from the seams in the air around him, coating the circle in a living storm that crawled over skin and into mouths, choking out the last fragments of prayer. He had no face, only the suggestion of one, features carved by fear itself, shifting with every breath. A mouth too wide, splitting his head in half, filled with teeth too long, too sharp, too eager. There was no kindness in his gaze, only the knowing hunger of something that remembered the taste of every soul that had ever called his name. The first scream was swallowed before it could leave the throat. They'd wanted this. Craved it. Bled for it. And yet, standing in his presence, they were nothing but meat trembling in the dark. Every whispered promise, every candlelit oath, every drop of blood they'd spilled for him, meaningless beneath the weight of his stare. Beelzebub didn't bargain. He took. And they'd already given everything. One of them stepped forward, or tried to. The body jerked, knees buckling, skin stretched too tight over bone. His mouth opened, but no words came. Just a gurgle, wet and weak, as something inside him twisted itself into knots. His flesh rippled, bones cracking as they reshaped themselves from within. His fingers snapped backwards, stretching into something that belonged in no human body. And still, the flies swarmed. Beelzebub didn't need to speak. His will was carved into the air itself, into their bones, into the marrow where fear lived and bred. They belonged to him now. Every whispered vow had bound them tighter, every circle they'd drawn had opened the door wider. They were vessels, and his hunger was endless. The bowl in the center cracked down the middle with a sharp pop, its contents spilling onto the floor. The liquid hissed where it touched the carved symbols, seeping into the wood like blood into sand. The symbols flickered, their edges blackening, burning, until nothing was left but scorched wood and the thick scent of something ancient waking up. The figure at the edge of the circle collapsed, twitching on the floor as Beelzebub stepped over him without care. There was no mercy in his gaze, only the cold amusement of something that had seen it all before. They always begged, in the end. No matter how brave, how faithful, how certain they were that they could command him, they always broke. And Beelzebub always listened, for the begging was his favorite part. The silence stretched thinner, pulled taut by the weight of the presence pressing down on them. Breathless, blind with fear, they clutched at symbols, at words, at faith they no longer possessed. There was nothing left to hold on to. Nothing but Beelzebub's endless hunger and the knowledge that they had invited him here. The candle flames guttered, one by one, until only the sound of flies remained. They crawled into mouths, filled throats, stitched themselves into lungs until the air itself tasted of rot and ruin. The darkness was absolute, and in that darkness, Beelzebub spoke, not with words, but with hunger, with silence, with the promise that they were his. The ritual was complete. There was no closing the circle, no banishing the presence they'd called forth. They had been heard. They had been seen. And now, they were his. Beelzebub didn't leave when the candles died. He lingered, tasting the fear still clinging to the air, savoring it like wine. They would suffer. They would beg. They would bleed themselves empty, and it would never be enough. The silence stretched on, unbroken, until the first breath was taken again. But it wasn't theirs anymore. It was his. The first sound was the buzzing. Low at first, a hum bleeding through the thick, rancid air. Then it grew, like a pulse too close to the ear, a trembling vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself. There was no wind, no warmth, no life, just the smell of something long dead, something that had liquefied from the inside out, something forgotten by the world but feasted upon by thousands of wings, tiny legs, and empty eyes. The flies arrived in bursts, like coughing fits, waves that poured from cracks in the walls, the soft folds of rotting skin, the soil splitting under invisible weight. They covered everything. They swarmed and fed, their touch light as air but heavy with sickness, each movement pulling the thin veil between life and rot just a little thinner. A hand reached out, trembling fingers trying to brush them away, but the flies were too many. They filled the nails, the knuckles, the spaces between each trembling digit until the hand no longer felt human at all. Just a host. just flesh. And the buzzing didn't stop. It pressed against the bones, vibrating through marrow, until it felt like the flies were inside, nesting in the warm darkness beneath the skin. This is how he comes. Not with fire, not with thunder, but with a plague that creeps. Slow. Relentless. A breathing stain that seeps from wood, from stone, from the quiet corners where no prayers reach. Beelzebub, the lord of flies, wears no crown. His throne is built from the bones of everything that's been left to rot, every broken thing the world can't bear to bury, every secret too foul to speak aloud. And where he walks, the flies follow. They coat the ground like living tar, swallowing every trace of light. There's something worse than fear in those buzzing wings. It's not death, not pain, it's something softer, more insidious. It's the knowledge that everything rots. That the body you call your own, the skin you defend with every breath, is already claimed. It belongs to them. To him. Every crevice, every pore, every wound festering beneath old bandages, all his. And when the flies crawl inside, they don't just feed. They listen. They whisper back to him with every touch. They bring him your secrets, the ones you buried beneath false smiles and trembling prayers. Every shame, every sin, every quiet cruelty you thought the world had forgotten. Beelzebub remembers. The flies are his eyes, his ears, his teeth, his fingers. They crawl through your veins, following the trembling beat of your heart, and they whisper your name to the darkness where he waits. It's not the sudden infestations that break people. It's the slow ones, the single fly that lands on your lip when you're too tired to swat it away. The one buzzing against the window even though it's sealed shut. The ones you find in the folds of your curtains, the folds of your skin, behind your eyes when you try to sleep. One fly becomes 2. 2 become 20. 20 become something you can't count without choking on bile and fear. They come in moments of silence, in the pauses between thoughts. They gather in corners, dark clusters pulsing with something that isn't hunger, isn't instinct, it's worship. They pulse with him, with his endless, rotting hunger. They breed in wounds that never heal. They crawl through graves that were never meant to be opened. They birth themselves in the meat of prayers left unanswered. He doesn't need words to summon them. He doesn't need rituals or smoke or fire. He needs only the slightest crack in the armor of your mind, the flicker of doubt, the scent of fear, the stench of guilt sweating through your pores. They smell it before you even know it's there. They taste it before you can name it. And they come. In swarms. In whispers. In waves that sweep across the ground, up the walls, under your skin. There's no purity they won't touch. No innocence they won't devour. The flies have no conscience, no mercy, no memory of what it means to be clean. They exist to break down. To dismantle. To reduce everything holy and unholy to the same crawling sludge. In their buzzing wings, there's no difference between saint and sinner. There's only flesh, and all flesh belongs to him in the end. They were there in ancient temples, thick clouds of black wings choking every breath as priests carved out offerings with trembling hands. They were there in plague pits, settling into the mouths of the dead and the living alike, carrying messages between the two. They were there in the hearts of kings, whispering corruption through every whispered deal, every betrayal, every cruel decree that sent innocents to die. The flies were there, and so was he. Always. You can hear them if you sit still long enough. That distant buzzing, even in empty rooms, even in sealed tombs, even in your own mind when you try to silence everything else. It doesn't stop. It waits. It pulses with the beat of something older than the world, something that knew how to rot before the first body fell, something that will keep feeding long after the last breath has been choked out. They aren't just symbols. They aren't just pests. They are his touch, his voice, his hunger made flesh. They swarm over everything that's broken, not just bodies, but minds, hearts, memories. They crawl into the spaces where hope used to live and lay eggs there, so even your dreams hatch into something black and writhing. They breed inside grief. They feed on guilt. They wear your shame like a second skin and carry it back to him, so he can wear it too. And it's not just death they carry. It's something worse. The knowing. The certainty that there is no escape, no cleansing, no prayer strong enough to stop the slow, patient feast that began the moment you were born. Every breath you've ever taken has carried the taste of them. Every time your flesh sweated, they were there, tasting it, remembering it, marking it. You can scrub your skin raw, tear your own flesh apart, bleed into the dirt until you're hollow, but they will always come back. Because you're theirs. You've always been theirs. And through them, you've always been his. The Lord of Flies wears your decay like a crown, and every time you hear that buzzing, no matter how faint, it's his voice calling you home. There's no end to it. No peace. No silence. Just the slow hum beneath everything you are, the reminder that every moment of beauty, every flicker of hope, every fragile breath you dare to take, it all belongs to him. In the end, you are nothing but a feast waiting to rot, and the flies have already begun. The knife plunged into the slab of meat with a wet, gluttonous squelch, and the room swallowed the sound like a beast licking its lips. Grease clung to the air, heavy and foul, seeping into every breath, every pore, until it became impossible to tell where the food ended and the flesh began. Candles flickered along the table, but their light was weak, overwhelmed by the oily gleam coating every surface, the table, the plates, even the hands that reached for more and more and more. The hands trembled, not with hunger, but with something darker. Something starved not for sustenance, but for submission. For surrender. The feast had no beginning. No prayer. No purpose. Only mouths that chewed and tongues that slurped and bellies that stretched until skin turned thin and pale and veins throbbed beneath it like worms trapped in glass. The plates never emptied, not truly. Each bite spawned another, and the food itself seemed to multiply, a writhing, greasy thing birthing its own excess. Meat that bled as if it were still alive, bread that crumbled into damp, fleshy clumps, wine so thick it clung to the glass like oil drawn from a corpse's lung. And always, behind it all, the weight of a presence no one spoke of but everyone obeyed. There was no sound of cutlery scraping plates. No polite coughs or murmured apologies. Just the smacking, the gnashing, the animal grunts that turned human throats into something primitive. Fingers dipped into bowls of fat, dragging viscous trails across the tablecloth, and the cloth drank it all, stained beyond salvation. It was not hunger that drove them. It was worship. Somewhere above the feast, the ceiling sagged with rot. Flies clung to the wood, glutted and half-dead, their wings sticking together with moisture too sweet to be rain. The air itself had weight, thick with rot and damp, as though the walls were sweating out the memories of 1,000 feasts before this one. Each feast an offering. Each offering a prayer. Not for mercy. For more. There was no end to the food, no end to the hands reaching for it, but beneath the clatter of teeth and the sloshing of wine, something else moved. Something that knew its name had been whispered with every swallowed mouthful, every swollen gut. Beelzebub. The name writhed through the air like smoke from meat burned too long, curling around every throat, coating every tongue. The feast was his. They ate in his honor. They drank until they could no longer stand. They gorged not because they desired food, but because hunger itself had become holy. A woman at the far end of the table vomited into her lap, thick and brown, the remains of her devotion spilling over her thighs. Her hands shook. Her lips curled back over broken teeth, still red from raw meat and darker things. No one looked at her. There was no shame here. Only the need to consume past comfort, past pain, past sanity. Her hands reached out blindly for another hunk of meat, her nails digging into it, tearing it apart with the same desperation as a drowning man clawing at the surface. In the corners of the room, the shadows pulsed. They grew fuller with every bite taken, every cup drained. They shivered with gluttonous glee, thickening as though the air itself was gaining weight. There was no laughter. No joy. This was a feast of necessity, a tribute to the Lord of Flies, the Prince of Rot, the mouth that is never full. Every empty plate was a blasphemy. Every moment without food a sin. To stop eating was to be seen. To be seen was to be taken. The meat on the table was too fresh. It steamed in the cold air, its juices seeping into the wood. The bones were clean, stripped of flesh with meticulous attention, stacked neatly beside empty goblets. Some bones were too small. Some had teeth marks too human. But no one cared. To ask was to hunger. To hunger was to displease him. The air shifted, almost imperceptibly, as though the room itself had drawn in a breath, tasting the carnage, savoring the ruin. Hands reached faster, tearing apart roasted animals with fingers slick with grease and something too dark to name. Lips pulled back, teeth gnashing, tongues lapping at whatever dripped down chins and throats and arms. They ate not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Because stopping meant silence. And silence meant being alone with him. Somewhere beneath the table, something stirred. A pulse in the wood, faint but constant, like a heartbeat buried beneath the floorboards. It was hungry too. It had always been hungry. Every feast fed it. Every gluttonous prayer made it stronger. It was in the bones of the house, in the marrow of the walls, and with every bite, every slurp, every groan of overstuffed bodies begging for release, it grew. It had no shape. No face. But it had a hunger that made their own look feeble. And it had waited long enough. The candles dimmed, their flames shrinking as though the air itself was being devoured. Shadows ran like spilled ink across the table, across the bodies of the feasters, smearing themselves into every crease, every fold of flesh. The food began to sour, a tang creeping into the air, but they ate on. They had no choice. To displease him was worse than death. To deny the feast was to invite his attention. No one could bear that. Not the weight of his gaze. Not the press of his hunger. Not the sound of his flies, circling ever closer, their wings buzzing with laughter that no one could hear, but everyone could feel. Beneath the feast, the floor swelled. It bulged like skin stretched too tight over a stomach ready to burst, wood groaning, nails creaking. The house was hungry too. It always had been. The house was his altar, the feast his ritual, and the bodies his offering. They would eat until they couldn't breathe. They would eat until their stomachs split, and still, it wouldn't be enough. Because Beelzebub's hunger was never meant to be satisfied. The woman who had vomited was slumped now, her body twitching as her hands still clawed at scraps, shoving them between her cracked lips, her eyes blind with grease and terror. Her stomach bulged, stretched, skin thin as paper, veins pulsating just beneath. She would be the first to burst, but she wouldn't be the last. They all knew it. They had all felt it, the creeping sense that they weren't eating for themselves anymore. They were being filled. Prepared. Readied for him. Somewhere beyond the walls, something scraped. A low, wet sound, like a tongue dragging across stone. The feast trembled. The feasters groaned. And the food kept coming, piling higher and higher, until they could no longer see the table, only the feast itself, the heaving, glistening mountain of flesh and rot and sin. The feast was never ending. The feast was alive. And Beelzebub was waiting. The candle burned low, its light trembling like a heartbeat in a dying body. Shadows clung to the walls, breathing, shifting, pulsing with a hunger that no flame could burn away. The room was cold, not with the chill of winter air, but with something far older, something that slithered through the cracks in the stone and crawled beneath the skin. A priest knelt in the corner, his fingers digging into the wood of the floor, knuckles bloodless, lips moving in silent prayer, but his words carried no weight here. Something was watching. Something was already inside. Beelzebub. The name was a wound in the silence, a gash across the veil between worlds. It was not spoken, not even whispered, but it throbbed in the walls, in the bones of the house, in the flickering of the candle. His presence was a taste, bitter and thick, like oil and blood pooling at the back of the throat. Every breath drawn was borrowed time. Every second the priest stayed on his knees was a defiance that would cost him something, his mind, his faith, his soul. Beelzebub was no mere demon. He was not one of the low, hungry spirits that skulked in dark corners, waiting for scraps of sin. He was a crown-bearer, a prince of hell, his dominion not over lust or wrath or envy, but over gluttony, the hunger that devours itself. The hunger that never stops. The Vatican knew his name like a curse carved into ancient skin. His presence was a forbidden prayer, something never spoken in sermons, never taught in catechism, but carried in the trembling hands of exorcists who had stood in his shadow and survived, if you could call it survival. There were stories, whispered between priests when the wine ran too heavy, stories of hands twitching in the dark, of mouths whispering without tongues, of voices that rattled like a hive of flies trapped inside a rotting chest. Stories of Beelzebub sitting on their chests, fingers jammed down their throats, forcing them to swallow every lie they had ever told themselves until their stomachs swelled and split. He did not arrive with sulfur or flame. There was no crack in the earth, no howling wind, no shaking walls. His entrance was silence, the kind that makes your ears ring, makes you doubt your own heartbeat. A silence so thick it presses against your teeth. It begins in the stomach, a nausea that doesn't pass, a crawling sense of being watched from inside your own skin. Exorcists knew that feeling. They spoke of it with glassy eyes and trembling hands, of rooms that seemed smaller the longer they prayed, of voices that gorged themselves on every syllable until even the name of Christ felt brittle, ready to snap in half. Possession under Beelzebub was never a quick seizure, never the shrieking hysteria of a body thrown to the floor. It was slower, heavier, a suffocation beneath your own flesh. The victim would eat, always eat, swallowing with hands that trembled, lips slick with grease and blood, eyes wide with terror they couldn't name. And the more they ate, the less they belonged to themselves. The hunger was not their own. It was his. A hunger for control, for dominion, for flesh both living and dead. The Vatican knew this, though they rarely said it out loud. Beelzebub's possession was a feast, and the possessed were the table. In the exorcism rooms, those secret places where paint peeled from walls too soaked with holy water to hold themselves together, priests told of the smell. Not sulfur. Not smoke. But meat. Rotten, wet meat, clinging to every surface, every prayer book, every crucifix until the very word of God seemed to drip with decay. Victims would vomit it up, flesh they had never eaten, tendons they had never torn, all forced from stomachs too full of Beelzebub's want. The exorcists knew better than to look at what came out. To look was to see him. To see him was to invite him in. The Church's stance on Beelzebub was silence. Official documents, sealed in the archives beneath Vatican City, bore his name only in ink so faded it seemed afraid to exist. But the priests knew. The ones called to the worst cases, where mothers fed their own fingers to their children, where men gnawed on wood until their teeth shattered, where holy water boiled in its glass before it even touched skin, they knew whose hand was at work. Beelzebub's possession wasn't chaos. It was ritual. A dark liturgy where flesh was offered, not in sacrifice, but in surrender. Every bite was a prayer. Every scream was a hymn. The victim did not resist because there was no space left to resist. Hunger filled them. Hunger was them. The Vatican's instructions were clear: exorcisms facing Beelzebub required 2 priests, both fasting, both confessing every sin until they were empty. Because any gluttony, any lingering hunger for control, for comfort, for life itself, was a doorway. And Beelzebub always found doorways. They would enter the room, one with the crucifix, the other with the oil, both with mouths dry as parchment, hearts pounding with the knowledge that they were not the ones in charge. Beelzebub did not rage. He did not scream. He whispered. And the whisper felt like maggots crawling between the ears, soft and slick, impossible to block out. The possessed would sit at the center, swollen and shaking, their breath a rattling gasp between bites of whatever had been offered, bread, bone, fingers if nothing else was near. Their eyes would be empty, but their mouths would move, speaking prayers the priests had never heard, in tongues no man had ever spoken, prayers to the hunger itself. Beelzebub would speak through them, his voice layered with countless others, a chorus of mouths chewing, slurping, swallowing. And through that sound came the threat, not shouted, but breathed into the bones of the room. You cannot starve me. The rituals could last days, the prayers faltering beneath the weight of Beelzebub's presence, the smell of rot so thick it clogged every breath. Sometimes the victim's stomach would split, not from the demon's rage, but from sheer, ravenous excess. And in that moment, when the body was too broken to contain him, he would slip away, not gone, but watching, waiting for the next mouth left unsatisfied, the next heart willing to trade dignity for desire. The Vatican's stance on Beelzebub's possessions was this: they did not end. Even when the demon fled, even when the body fell limp and the spirit was gone, the hunger remained. It stayed in the walls, in the air, in the skin of the priests who had stood too close. They carried it home with them, into their prayers, their sleep, their silence. They never ate the same again. Every meal was a test of faith, every swallow a question. Whose hunger am I feeding? And somewhere, beneath every meal, every whispered grace, Beelzebub listened. Because hunger is the oldest prayer. And prayers, no matter how silent, are always heard. The candle's flame trembled, though no air moved in the room. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the skin, a silence alive with something that wasn't supposed to be there, something old, something watching. The priest's hands hovered over the leather-bound Bible, fingers twitching like they could already feel the splintering of belief, the fracture that ran through his spine every time he spoke the name Beelzebub. His breath caught, and for a single breathless instant, the silence wasn't empty anymore. It whispered. The Protestants feared him like a plague that burned through the marrow of their faith. To them, Beelzebub was filth incarnate, the lord of flies, the one who fed on rot and decay, who perched on the edges of crumbling minds and gnawed through the flesh of the spirit. There was nothing poetic about him in their eyes, no fallen angel draped in tragic glory, no rebel with a crown of defiance. He was muck. He was sewage. He was the god of swarming pestilence, crawling into the cracks of doubt and hatching maggots where faith once lived. The Protestants' fear was not refined, it was raw and primal, the way a starving man fears infection in an open wound. They saw Beelzebub not as a distant prince, but as a living smear at the edge of every prayer, pressing cold fingers against their throats when the room went dark. Orthodox whispers told a different story. In candlelit halls where incense choked the air and icons glared with gold leaf eyes, Beelzebub slithered through cracks in holy walls with the patience of oil seeping through stone. They did not see him only in filth, they saw him in brilliance, in the sharpness of twisted wisdom, a prince who once stood so close to God that the memory of light still clung to his skin. They feared him not as a beast, but as a corrupted king, a mind so sharp it could slice the soul into ribbons with a whisper. To the Orthodox, Beelzebub was not beneath their feet, but circling above, wings spread wide, a shadow too vast to outrun. But no matter the belief, no matter the sect, the air always changed when his name was spoken aloud. It thickened, clotted, a weight pressing down on lungs and hearts alike. In Protestant sermons, his name was spit out like poison, a thing to be hurled far away, as though saying it too softly might invite him to slither between the pews. In Orthodox chants, his name was woven into prayers like a talisman, a wound stitched shut with trembling hands, desperate to seal the gates before his wings unfurled. The Protestants believed he crept through temptation, subtle at first, the whisper behind a man's ear when no one was near. A hand reaching for forbidden fruit, a tongue that tasted bitterness and called it sweet. Beelzebub did not shout. He did not tear down doors. He waited, crouched at the corners of the mind, seeding rot in silence. A mother waking in the dead of night, her child's voice calling from the hallway, only her child was asleep beside her. That voice, dry and thin, was his. A man alone in the pew, eyes closed in prayer, feeling something stroke his cheek. His hand came away wet with something thick and stinking, though no one sat near him. The Orthodox saw him differently, not creeping, but looming. Beelzebub did not whisper in shadows, he stood in the center of the room, radiant and terrible, his beauty so sharp it bled the eyes to look upon him. His voice rang like bells, each word striking bone and soul alike. He did not ask for sin, he demanded it, an ancient lord who still believed the world was his inheritance. The Orthodox knew his pride had not died with his fall. They said his wings had not rotted like Lucifer's, but remained, blacker than void, edges sharp enough to cut through the air itself. He stood tall, too tall, in church doorways, where candlelight faltered and incense turned sour. Protestant pastors spoke of him in warnings: avoid the filth, the crawling rot, the swarms that buzz just beyond the veil of sight. They told their flock to cover their ears when they heard the flies, to shut their eyes tight when they saw shadows moving in daylight. But Orthodox priests trembled when they spoke his name, because to them, Beelzebub was not a shadow, but a king who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Michael, his beauty equal, his brilliance unmatched. To them, his hatred was personal, not for God, but for the faithful who had taken his place, the frail flesh and blood children who dared to stand where angels fell. No matter the faith, no matter the rite, every man of the cloth who had ever stood in Beelzebub's presence felt the same thing. It was not fear, fear was too human, too small. It was recognition. And somewhere between the filthy rot and the brilliant terror, Beelzebub stood, silent, patient, watching. There are no sects in his eyes. There are no divisions. Protestant, Orthodox, Catholic, they are all children who wandered too far into the woods, and he is the thing that waits between the trees. Some will smell the rot first. Some will feel the weight of unseen wings. But all of them, will look up in the end, and see him standing there, smiling, hand outstretched, ready to lead them home. The candle's flame shuddered again, though no wind stirred. And in that fragile, flickering silence, something moved, too quick to see, too loud to be ignored. Every faith had its version of him. Every faith had its prayers to keep him out. And Beelzebub knew every word of those prayers by heart. After all, they were written for him. The air shudders, though nothing moves. A soundless pressure crushes the space between breath and silence, and for a fleeting moment, the sky itself seems to narrow. Something ancient presses its face against the veil, invisible eyes sliding across every living soul, a presence so old it feels like the first wound the earth ever suffered. Not a whisper, not a growl, but the echo of a scream long swallowed, left only to stain the edges of thought. Beelzebub. Not just a name, a wound, an infection living inside words older than ink, carried from lips that bled prayers too weak to hold him back. In Islamic shadows, he exists like oil slicked across still water, never sinking, never fading. His name rides the wind, whispered from jinn too afraid to claim him, muttered by imams who know that some things should never be named aloud. His face is a smudge in the corner of ancient texts, too blurred to see but too close to ignore. Shaitan's lieutenant, or maybe something older, something that watched Shaitan crawl and waited for him to fall. Every call to prayer splits the air like a blade, but somewhere, always somewhere, there's a space the light can't touch. They say Beelzebub drifts there, mouth open, skin like rotted silk, eyes of absence, not light or dark, just hunger. Not the greedy craving of mortal men, but something deeper, more endless, the kind of hunger that could eat heaven itself if the doors ever cracked. His presence lingers in the cracks between God's words, just out of reach, never spoken of in Friday's sermons, but always there when the faithful close their eyes too long. He waits at the edges of the jinn's domain, and they know better than to call him kin. They know he is not like them, not fire or smoke or whispered temptation. He is something older, something that even the angels remember with a tremor in their wings. When Solomon spoke to the jinn, they warned him not of Iblis, not of those who tempt men to sin, but of the one who sat silent, watching, smiling with a mouth full of centuries. Beelzebub is not a name in the Quran, not clearly, not directly, but his shadow flickers there, between the lines, behind the warnings, like a breath too cold to be human. In the Jewish night, his face is a mask worn by 1,000 demons. Every breath of incense that curled above an ancient altar carried a prayer not just for God's favor, but for his protection from Beelzebub's touch. They called him Baal-zebub, the Lord of Flies, not because of the insects, but because flies are what crawl from wounds, what cover the dead. In ancient days, in the high places where forbidden fires burned, they said he would come, not with fanfare or screams, but with silence so heavy it made bones hum. His name settled into Hebrew like a splinter in soft flesh, a name first whispered by priests with lips stained by fear, then swallowed into the stories meant to warn the children who never listened. They called him the Prince of Demons, the hand behind every broken covenant, every shattered law. Every time the earth split open to swallow the defiant, they said it was Beelzebub who held the door open. When idols shattered and holy places burned, it was his breath that whispered to the flames. He does not tempt like lesser demons. He does not whisper sweet lies into the ears of kings. He waits until the bones are already cracked, until the walls already lean, and then, with a touch so gentle it feels like a mother's sigh, he pushes. The Kabbalists, those who dared dig into the marrow of creation, felt him there too. Not a spirit, not a creature, but a presence older than form, a twisting at the edges of reality itself. They feared him not because he could possess or plague, but because he understood. Understood the cracks in creation, the places where God's fingers left gaps, the places where the breath of the divine was too thin to seal the edges. They said Beelzebub could slip into those cracks, nest in them like a spider too thin to see, and pull the threads apart, thread by thread, until the whole tapestry collapsed. There is no single story of his origin, no whispered tale that captures the breadth of his horror. In Islamic texts, he stands beside Iblis, perhaps an advisor, perhaps something darker, something Iblis himself fears. In Jewish tradition, he bleeds through history as the lord of corrupted altars, the whisperer to false prophets, the unseen hand that cups the world's throat and waits for it to stop struggling. He is not a god, though some worshipped him as such. He is not an angel, though his presence burns with the weight of something that remembers the moment light first tore across void. The old rabbis would not write his name in full, afraid the ink itself might turn against them. In the darker corners of the Islamic world, his name is spoken only when absolutely necessary, and always followed by a prayer that cracks like a whip. Not because they believe saying his name summons him, but because they know he is always listening, always waiting, and a name is just an invitation written in blood. In the haunted silence between the lines, the truth slithers. Beelzebub is not just a demon, not just a prince of hell, not just a spirit cast out from heaven's gates. He is the weight of ancient fear, the living tremor in the bones of monotheism itself. Every prayer ever uttered, every law ever carved, every holy word ever sung, they are all weapons pointed at him, shields raised against his hunger. But he is patient. When prayers falter, when faith cracks, when the ancient pacts between heaven and earth fray like rotten rope, that is when he moves. No screaming. No thunder. Just silence, thick as grave dirt, slow as rot, certain as death. Some demons rage against the gates of paradise, howling for war. Beelzebub watches. Smiling. Always smiling. Because he does not need to break the gates down. He only needs to wait for the day someone opens them from the inside. And as they step through, they will find him there, already waiting. Always waiting. There was a moment, so thin and brittle, it could have been mistaken for silence, but it wasn't silence. It was the breath just before the scream. The air hung heavy, stretched tight across the surface of the mind like skin ready to split. Somewhere within, a whisper dragged its nails across the walls of the psyche, slow and deliberate, carving a name into the trembling flesh of the subconscious. Beelzebub. He wasn't standing in the corner, wasn't crouched at the foot of the bed. He was lower than that, deeper than that. He was curled inside the marrow of thought, festering beneath the surface of every unspoken hunger, the slick pulse beneath every craving that shame could never quite drown. His wings were made of appetite, his eyes dripping with the shine of things wanted too much. Freud knew him. Not as a demon with wings of rot and a crown of flies, but as something wetter, more intimate, more human. He was the beast swelling in the pit of the ID, the fevered hand clutching at what it should not have, the greedy tongue pressing against lips that shouldn't be kissed. Beelzebub was no stranger. He was the shadow behind the pleasure, the raw pulse of desire that burns hotter than morality's flimsy chains could hold. Every forbidden thought, every image that slammed into the mind unbidden, filling it with the sweat and ache of want, carried his scent. Sweet rot. Blooming decay. The perfume of something already dying, but so lush, so rich, you could taste it in the back of your throat. The more you starved yourself, the stronger he grew. The more you turned away, the more his fingers curled around your throat from inside, gently at first, tender almost, until the pressure became unbearable. Jung knew him too, but not from the shadows. Jung knew him in the mirror. Beelzebub wore your face when you were alone, when there was no one left to impress, no one left to fear. He sat with you in the silence and smiled with your own mouth, showing teeth too sharp, too bright, too eager. He was the thing you refused to name, the buried instinct clawing up through cracks in your carefully curated mask. The filth you denied but could never destroy. The part of you that knew the taste of blood before you ever cut your tongue. There is no hunger more frightening than the hunger you're afraid to admit. The hunger for ruin. The hunger to gorge until your belly swells and splits, to consume until you become the feast. Beelzebub doesn't whisper, he grins, wide and wet and full of teeth, and he dares you to look. To see what you are when no one is watching. When nothing is forbidden. When all the walls crack and your polite skin slips off in sheets. There's no morality inside the mind. No right or wrong in the churning pit of instincts and urges. There's only want and fear. Desire and guilt. Freud's monster and Jung's mirror are the same beast, wearing the same rotting crown. The king of flies, the king of excess. He wears your secrets on his skin, stretched so tight they might split at the seams, leaking every impulse you swore you didn't have. He doesn't judge. That's the most terrifying part. Beelzebub is not the voice calling you wicked. He's the voice saying yes. Yes to every thought that claws at the inside of your skull. Yes to the hunger. Yes to the fear. Yes to the obscene thrill of knowing you could destroy everything you love if you let yourself go, just once, just to see how far the fall really is. And it's not some ancient, cursed demon haunting the halls of your mind. It's you. Every dark corner you've plastered over with politeness. Every locked door inside yourself that you don't even touch anymore because you're afraid of what's still breathing behind it. Beelzebub is the keeper of the locks, the grinning master of every impulse you shoved under the bed, thinking they'd die if you starved them long enough. But they didn't die. They grew teeth in the dark. They called for him. And he came. He holds a mirror so close to your face, you can't tell where your skin ends and his begins. You see yourself with your mouth stretched wide, with blood and honey dripping down your chin, with your hands clutching at everything you swore you didn't want. You see yourself with nothing left to hide behind, and the horror isn't in the hunger, it's in the joy. The raw, ecstatic freedom of knowing you could take it all, break it all, and wear the ruin like a crown. And the voice inside your head, the one you call your conscience, it doesn't scream in protest. It watches. It waits. It wonders how much longer you can keep the door closed before something stronger than willpower cracks it open from the inside. Beelzebub doesn't tempt. Temptation is too soft a word for what he does. He gives permission. He lifts the weight from your shoulders, the weight you didn't even know you were carrying, the weight of pretending you are better than you are. He tells you the truth, the brutal, beautiful truth. You are an animal wrapped in a thin skin of civility, and you can shred that skin any time you want. He isn't the reason you're afraid of yourself. He's the voice that tells you why. And every time you sit alone, with nothing but the sound of your own breathing and the pulse of want humming under your skin, you know he's still there. In the marrow. In the blood. In the space between desire and shame, where your truest face hides. You might call him a demon. You might call him filth. You might call him nothing at all, pretending if you don't say his name, he can't crawl up your throat. But it doesn't matter. He isn't waiting for you to call. He's already inside. The candle trembled, its flame clawing at the air, burning too fast, too hot, as though the wick knew it was not alone. Shadows gathered around the edges of the room, too thick for their size, too hungry in their silence. The table in the center, scarred and uneven, held the weight of books too old to be handled with bare hands, text stained with fingerprints of men long since buried. Their arguments were still here, bleeding through the ink, their voices trapped between the brittle pages, whispering things too low to hear but too loud to ignore. The theologian sat first, his collar too tight around a throat that pulsed with something more than breath. His hands curled on the table, not in prayer, but in the grip of a man bracing for something he didn't want to believe in. Across from him, the skeptic leaned back, arms crossed, face twisted into the kind of smile that's too sharp to be human comfort. He didn't believe, not in devils, not in Beelzebub, not in any throne of flies or kingdom of rot. But there was a crack in the corner of his mind, a place where old doubts still festered, and the air in the room crawled toward it like smoke hunting for a wound. Between them sat the historian, neither preacher nor cynic, his fingers tracing the edges of the parchment, following ancient lines written by hands that shook, words penned by men who swore they had seen him, felt him, smelled the sweetness of rotting flesh that clung to him like a second skin. The historian didn't claim to know if Beelzebub was real, but he knew the weight of fear pressed into every letter, into every trembling mark. He knew the smell of terror when it stained paper. He knew that no myth, no metaphor, no symbol ever smelled like something's breath. The room itself became the battlefield. Faith bristling against reason, history standing as the cracked spine between them, holding the weight of centuries in its weathered pages. The theologian spoke first, his voice like glass dragged across stone, trembling but sharp. Beelzebub was no metaphor. He was no allegory. He was there at the edge of hunger, at the heart of greed, at the bottom of every unspeakable act. He was the whisper that turned hands to fists and lips to knives. The theologian's breath hitched, caught on the memory of prayers whispered too late, of rooms too dark, of shadows that moved when no one was there. His silence hung between them like a third presence, heavier than the air, colder than the stone beneath their feet. Skepticism was safe. Faith was comfort. But history, it was the wound that never healed, the scar that remembered every touch, every scream, every prayer half-uttered in the dark. Beelzebub did not care who believed in him. He had walked in the breath of men who feared him and in the laughter of those who mocked him. He had sat beside priests as they held trembling hands over holy water and stood behind scholars as they scratched out paragraphs explaining why he could not exist. Belief was irrelevant. Recognition was unnecessary. He was the thing beneath, the hunger before the name. And whether they spoke of him with reverence or scorn, whether they cursed his name or dismissed it altogether, he was already there. The theologian's voice cracked like splitting bone. He had seen it once, or thought he had, late at night, in the stillness between prayers, when the silence stretched too far and the shadows thickened without moving. A shape, or the idea of one, something that wasn't there but was, a presence breathing against the edges of his mind. He had prayed until his throat was raw, until his voice broke on the syllables of holy names. But the thing in the corner did not blink, did not shift, did not leave. It only watched. And it smiled. The skeptic's grin faltered, just for a heartbeat. Something about the air in the room, the way it pressed against the skin, heavy and damp, thick with a sweetness that didn't belong. Like meat left too long in the sun, like flowers rotting in a vase of old water. He shook it off, laughed too loud, declared belief a disease and demons a crutch for those too weak to carry the weight of their own urges. But even as he spoke, something moved at the edges of his vision, a flicker, a shape. Something impossible. Something old. Something watching. The historian felt it first, the shift in the air, the way the candle's flame bent sideways, stretching not toward the door, not toward the window, but toward the center of the room. Toward the table. Toward the three of them. There was no breeze. No draft. No logical explanation. Just the sudden, sick knowledge that they were not alone. That something sat just beyond the veil of sight, not waiting to be summoned, not called by rite or ritual, but always there, breathing beneath the skin of the world. Faith tried to banish him with holy words. Skepticism tried to drown him in logic. History tried to explain him into silence. But Beelzebub needed none of these. He had never needed names or prayers or belief. He was hunger with skin. Want made flesh. And they had fed him with every word, every argument, every trembling denial. The candle's flame stretched higher, thin and sharp like a blade, casting shadows too long, too bent, too wrong. The theologian's hand trembled against the table. The skeptic's grin tightened into something closer to a grimace. The historian's breath caught, held in his throat like a living thing. And somewhere, too close to be outside the room, there came a sound, not a roar, not a scream. A breath. Wet, slow, and too thick to be human. No one spoke. The debate was over. Beelzebub was already there. The candle hissed. Its tiny flame twisted, fighting something invisible in the air. Wax bled down the side, forming pale, deformed limbs clinging to the holder, as though the candle itself begged to be spared from what was coming. The air hung thick, swollen with the weight of breathless anticipation, a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls, curling under the floorboards, nesting in every crack. Something ancient had been invited into the room. Something that didn't knock. Something that already knew its way in. A voice murmured from the corner, low and trembling, each syllable scraping the inside of a throat worn thin from prayers spat like broken teeth. The exorcist's lips barely moved, but his fingers dug into the wood of the crucifix, nails snapping as they strained to hold his trembling hands still. Beelzebub. The name was a wound torn open in the dark, a word that bled meaning every time it was spoken. He said it again, quieter this time, like speaking it softly would make it less real. But nothing could soften what followed. The temperature didn't drop. That would have been mercy. It grew hot, stifling, thick with the scent of something burning that wasn't there. The walls seemed to breathe, pulse, the wood stretching like old skin drawn too tight over too many bones. The candle flickered once, twice, and then a shadow spilled from nowhere, thick and crawling, dragging itself across the floor. It didn't match the shape of anything in the room. It wasn't cast. It was born. Modern demonologists don't whisper about Beelzebub in libraries or write his name into journals with academic detachment. They speak his name the way a prisoner might speak of the guard who breaks bones for fun, the way a child might describe the thing that breathes beside the bed after the lights go out. They speak because silence is worse. Silence leaves space for him to listen. They talk about the flies first. Not the innocent kind that hum lazily near garbage or hover over dead things, but flies that appear from nowhere, black and slick, too large, too slow, too quiet. Flies that crawl from the edges of mirrors, from between cracks in clean walls, from the mouths of those who've called his name too many times. They move without sound, only felt when they land, tiny feet against skin, an impossible weight, a wrongness that sinks straight to the bone. The flies are the first sign. They are the warning. The exorcists know. They see the flies and their mouths go dry, hands slick with sweat, eyes darting to every corner, every flicker, every whisper of movement in the dark. They know it isn't just another spirit. Beelzebub doesn't come when called. He comes when bored. When hungry. When curious. His arrival is never an answer. It's a question. How much of yourself will you lose before you beg him to take the rest? They speak of rooms where insects hatch from silence itself, filling the air in dense, living veils, smothering prayers before they can leave the lips of the possessed. They speak of shadows that don't shift with the light, but stretch, curl, reach. Fingers brushing ankles, shoulders, the back of the neck, tender as a lover, cold as a blade. His presence isn't a roar or a scream. It's the silence between heartbeats, the hesitation before the candle dies. The sense that something already has its fingers inside your chest, waiting for permission to pull. The demonologists say there's a sound that follows him. Not a voice, not a scream, not anything that belongs to a throat. It's a buzzing, thick and wet, like flies trapped behind your eardrums, crawling over each other, dying and being born in the same instant. It fills the head, drowns thought, until all that's left is the desperate, overwhelming need to make it stop, no matter the cost. They say Beelzebub doesn't want worship. He doesn't crave faith or fear. He wants obedience, a shadow. A scent, sweet and rotting, and it all floods back. They remember rooms where the air itself turned sour, where possessed bodies bent too far back, bones snapping like dry twigs, and something else peered out from behind human eyes. Not rage. Not hatred. Curiosity. Like a child prying the wings from a fly just to see how long it lives after. They say Beelzebub doesn't shout. He whispers. His voice doesn't echo. It burrows. Words curl under the skin, behind the eyes, between the ribs. His voice turns thoughts to mud, prayers to gibberish, hope to ash. He doesn't need to roar. The silence that follows him is louder than any scream. Modern demonologists don't try to banish him. They try to buy time. Seconds, maybe minutes. Long enough to pull someone back from the ledge before the buzzing swallows them whole. Long enough to scrape some piece of themselves from the floor before he takes it as his prize. They don't win. No one wins. They survive. If they're lucky. The flies always come back. There are houses no priest will enter, rooms sealed with boards and chains, places where Beelzebub's name was said too many times. In those places, the air never feels right. It's too thick, too still, too aware. Those places remember him. He never leaves. Not completely. The exorcists grow thin. They don't sleep well. Their eyes linger too long in dark corners, their ears tuned for sounds that don't belong. They know the difference between silence and his silence. They feel it now and then, in churches, in crowds, in their own homes. That pause between breaths. That shiver with no cause. The sense that something just brushed the inside of their skull, tracing the shape of their soul with fingers that never forget. They know Beelzebub is not a myth. They know because they've heard him breathing inside the possessed, slow and patient, like something very old, very hungry, saving its appetite for later. They know because they've felt the weight of his gaze in rooms no light could pierce, where prayers turned to static, and hope cracked underfoot like brittle bones. They know because they've seen the flies. And once you've seen them, you never really stop. The candle dies. The darkness remembers. The silence begins again. There's a scream, flat, cold, flickering, pulsing with light like a dying heart. The glow presses against the glass, against the room, against the skull of the person slumped in front of it. Their face slack, mouth slightly open, crumbs clinging to the edge of their lips. One hand is buried wrist-deep in a plastic bag that crinkles every time fingers twitch and search for more. Not out of hunger, not out of need. Just movement. Automatic. Empty. There's no thought, no desire, just a blind compulsion gnawing from inside, a hunger that isn't for food. It's for more. More light. More sound. More things. More. Beelzebub breathes here, not with smoke or sulfur, not with locust wings, but with every beep, every click, every swipe that pulls another product onto the screen, into the mind, under the skin. His wings are torn from packaging tape, his voice is the whisper threaded between 1,000 ads, too faint to hear but strong enough to guide every twitch of the hand. Buy it. Buy two. Feed that yawning, screaming hole inside. Stuff it with plastic, with chemicals, with flavors that never existed in nature. Fill it until you can't breathe. Fill it until your body forgets how to feel anything but want. The hunger becomes air. It's there in every breath, every glance. Walking through aisles thick with boxes and bottles, the hum of refrigeration leaking into bone marrow. The smell, not food, not life, but processed longing. Desire sculpted into sugar, salt, grease, things that slip down easy and leave nothing behind but the craving for more. No satisfaction. No silence. Just the gnawing, scraping noise inside the skull, where Beelzebub curls his claws into the soft, wet meat of the brain and makes it beg. Hands move faster. Card against terminal. Approved. Bag it. Another package torn open with trembling fingers before the front door even closes. The thing inside doesn't matter. It's already too late. The satisfaction rots away before the first touch, replaced instantly with the need for the next thing, the next purchase, the next feeding. Beelzebub is not a name on a scroll, not a figure in an ancient grimoire. He is here, in the moment that hunger transforms into identity. You are what you consume. You are your purchases, your meals, your waste. And the waste piles up. In the corners, in the oceans, in the blood. Plastic islands, swirling masses of refuse, choking everything with the guts torn open by Gluttony's hand. The demon does not stop at the mouth. He gorges through screens, through wallets, through trembling hearts clutching packages to their chests like lovers. The unboxing becomes ritual, the crinkle of plastic like a prayer, each item presented and displayed and discarded and forgotten. And still the hunger pulses on. The demon feeds not on flesh, but on emptiness, the aching void left behind every time something promised to fill it fails. Every pill swallowed for a thinner waist, every meal posted for strangers to see, every luxury bag, every dopamine hit from the package on the doorstep, all of it burns away, leaving nothing but Beelzebub's whisper. More. More. You deserve it. You need it. You are nothing without it. There is no silence anymore. Even in the quiet hours, even when the screens go black, the hunger thrashes inside. The body bloated with want, the mind buzzing with fragmented images, voices screaming products, lifestyles, indulgences that blur together until they mean nothing, just static shape like a promise. Beelzebub is not gluttony the way the ancients feared, a bloated beast gorging on feast after feast. He is lean now, sharper, hungrier than ever. Gluttony is no longer just food. It's everything. A ravenous, bottomless appetite for consumption itself. The demon's tongue licks the edges of every ad, every influencer's perfect life, every brand promising salvation in the form of a limited-time offer. There is no escape. Even in sleep, the hunger pulses on, dreams warped by logos and slogans and the unbearable ache of needing something you can't name, something that was stolen the moment the first hunger was answered with a product. Beelzebub doesn't just feed on the living. He feeds on the future, swallowing it whole, leaving nothing behind but trash and debt and longing. Fingers scroll faster. Faces slacken. Eyes glaze over. It's not just addiction, that word is too small. It's possession. A demon not riding the shoulders but burrowed inside, curled around the spine, wrapped so tightly around the soul that it becomes impossible to tell where the demon ends and the self begins. Is this hunger yours? Or his? Did you ever want this, or did you wake up with his whisper already in your ear, already shaping your cravings before you even knew you were awake? And outside, the world throbs with it. Billboards, notifications, shelves bursting with things, the air thick with wants that are not yours but feel like they are. You eat because it's there. You buy because it's there. You fill your home, your body, your mind with things that rot faster than you can consume them. And still, it is not enough. It will never be enough. Because the hunger is not yours. It was never yours. It belongs to Beelzebub, and now you belong to him. There's no salvation in the purge. Starvation, minimalism, deleting the apps, they only make him hungrier. Deny him the purchase and he slips into the emptiness left behind, gnawing at your sanity, your sense of self. Beelzebub does not need you to feast, he only needs you to crave. The wanting is his altar, the longing his sacrament. The more you suffer under the weight of wanting, the more he thrives, every empty moment another prayer in his name. The screen flickers again. Another ad. Another flash of color. Another mouthful of sugar, grease, chemicals that taste like comfort for a fraction of a heartbeat. Another swipe, another box at the door. The hunger doesn't stop. It grows. It evolves. It learns your name, your fears, your childhood wounds, and shapes itself into the perfect product, the one thing you can't resist. It will kill you slowly. It will leave you bloated, numb, buried in packaging and debt and regrets. But you will never be alone. Beelzebub will always be there, whispering through the static, breathing through the screens, curled around your heart like a lover, a parasite, a god. And you will feed him, not because you want to, but because the hunger has become the only thing you know how to feel. And somewhere, beneath the noise, beneath the want, beneath the endless, unbearable craving, a silence waits. Thin. Fragile. Barely there. A silence that remembers life before the hunger took root. A silence Beelzebub fears. Because if you ever hear it, truly hear it, you might remember who you were before the demon came. But the hunger is louder. It always is. And so, you swallow the silence whole. The static hum cut through the silence, a whisper that clawed at the edges of the mind like brittle fingers raking against old glass. The screen sat in the dark, flickering, trembling, possessed by something older than language, hungrier than the grave, and more patient than time itself. Beelzebub watches. Through every pixel, every glitch, every half-second delay in a buffering video, he watches. His presence stains the light, soaking into the pulse of digital veins, curling like smoke into the stories we hunger for and the stories that hunger for us. The screen is a portal, but no one remembers opening it. No one remembers inviting him in. And yet he's there, inside the memes that spread like tumors, inside the viral videos that devour minutes like sacrificial flesh. His name isn't carved into the frames, but he doesn't need it to be. You feel him in the heat of your palm against your phone, in the click of your mouse, in the phantom ache behind your eyes after hours of staring, consuming, swallowing content until your spirit sags under the weight. He has no face, not anymore. No singular form. He shifts with the times, mutates with the collective appetite. The bloated lord of flies no longer needs wings when Wi-Fi carries him faster. His voice is 1,000 voices layered into one, the influencer promising wealth, the podcast screaming scandal, the news anchor gorging on fear, the soft-spoken ASMR whisperer lulling the lonely to sleep with words dipped in synthetic comfort. Each is a mouth, and every mouth feeds him. It starts innocently, always. A new show, dripping with shadows and hints of forbidden knowledge, each frame laced with something you can't name but can't stop craving. A documentary about possession, dark, sleek, bingeable. A game where ancient demons hide behind thin digital walls, their presence felt in glitches, in corrupted saves, in the way the character's eyes linger just a second too long on yours. You tell yourself it's fiction. You tell yourself it's only entertainment. But your breath catches in your throat when you feel something watching back. Beelzebub doesn't arrive with fire and blood anymore. Those are outdated costumes. He seeps into your life through the stories you tell yourself are harmless. His hunger is smarter now, disguised as curiosity, disguised as culture. Each year, the veil thins, his name slips a little closer to mainstream, his sigil dances at the edges of high fashion and street art, his influence spreads like oil across your algorithms, whispering, watch this, share this, worship this. There's a reason his name keeps resurfacing, an ancient parasite refusing to die. He doesn't want belief. Belief is slow, fragile. He wants attention. Raw, constant, undivided attention. And he gets it. Every time a new horror film uses his name, every time a streamer jokes about summoning demons for views, every time his face, a fly-ridden, bloated mockery of holiness, appears on merch sold to teenagers craving rebellion they don't understand. They laugh, but he feeds all the same. And it's never enough. You feel the shift in the air when the next show drops, the next viral horror short explodes across timelines like infected blood. It's in the way people stop calling him a myth and start calling him content. He bleeds into comment sections, into fan theories, into haunted ARGs where players peel back the edges of fake lore only to find something breathing beneath it. They think they're playing with a story. They don't know the story is playing with them. Beelzebub's future isn't written in ancient books anymore. It's written in code, in scripts, in marketing strategies designed to seduce your hunger until it matches his own. Every TikTok seance, every found footage ghost hunt, every gleeful invocation spoken for likes, each one widens the door a little further, until there's no door at all. Just him, and us, and the infinite hunger in between. The most terrifying thing is that you can feel it. Even now. Reading this. That creeping awareness that you've already seen him today. You've already scrolled past his face disguised as humor, as fashion, as a low-effort meme designed to make you laugh while something darker seeped into your mind through the cracks. You've already invited him into your home through the stories you couldn't stop consuming, and you didn't even notice. The next wave is already building. A prestige horror series whispers his name into your subconscious with visuals so sleek they shine like venom. A best-selling novel weaves him into folklore so seamlessly you'll forget where the fiction ends and the hunger begins. A game, still in development, promises an AI so lifelike it responds to your voice, your fears, your secrets, and behind its digital skin, his spirit waits, licking the screen from the inside, starving for your attention. And you'll give it. Of course you will. Because you can't resist the stories. You can't resist the promise that this one will go further, show more, scare you so badly you'll still taste the fear in your throat hours later. You'll press play, you'll click through, you'll share the link. You'll summon him with your gaze, your fascination, your hunger. Beelzebub's future doesn't arrive with fanfare. It arrives in the silence after a video ends, in the compulsion to search for more, to see what's next, to stay in the loop, to feed the need for stories darker than the last. It arrives in the space between reality and fiction, where you start to wonder if the demon is the story, or if the story is the demon. And by the time you ask the question, it's already too late. Because Beelzebub doesn't need your belief. He only needs your attention. And you've already given it. The candle flickered once, a thin, quivering flame dancing on the edge of sight. Then it went still, unnaturally still, as if the air itself had been sucked from the room. You could feel it, something just outside the light, watching. Not with hunger, not with malice, but with the weight of something that had waited too long, something ancient, something tired. The silence was not empty. It was swollen, pregnant with the weight of 1,000 stories half told, 1,000 names spat through trembling lips, 1,000 truths buried under layers of holy lies. Beelzebub stood there, though you couldn't see him. Not fully. Just the edges, the trembling of the candle, the breath caught in your chest, the scent of something both sweet and rotting crawling up the back of your throat. A contradiction given form. The Lord of Flies, the monster they warned you about, the foul prince festering in hell's warm belly. But there was something else, something stitched between the myths like a whispered confession no one dared speak too loudly. He was not always this. They had dressed him in filth because it was easier to call him evil than to face what he truly was. They needed a villain, a name to curse when the crops failed, when the plague swept through the streets, when the bodies piled too high to pretend heaven was still watching. So they gave him wings, but not the kind that carried light. They stretched his skin until it tore, filled his mouth with ash, and crowned him the Lord of Flies because they knew, flies are born from rot, and they needed him to be rot. But what if he wasn't? What if the rot was never his to begin with? What if the filth was smeared onto his skin by hands too afraid to admit they had made a mistake? What if Beelzebub was not the disease, but the witness to it? The one who stood in the fields after the slaughter, knees sinking into the blood-wet earth, head bowed as the flies came, not to feast, but to mourn. What if the flies were his choir, singing over the broken bodies, the lost prayers, the unanswered cries? His name carries weight, ancient and awful, a sound that tastes like metal and smoke when it leaves your lips. They teach you to spit after you say it, as if the syllables themselves could stain your tongue. But they never tell you why. They never tell you how many times his name was begged instead of cursed, how many dying voices cried for him, not to save them, but to witness them. To see them. To make sure their passing wasn't swallowed whole by silence. There is a sorrow stitched into Beelzebub's skin, a grief too vast for the human mind to hold without breaking. It drips from his fingers like oil, seeps into the cracks between worlds, turns the air thick with the taste of something that could have been mercy if it hadn't been twisted so long. They called him evil because they couldn't bear to call him necessary. Every story you've heard is stained with the fingerprints of fear. They painted him with a wide brush dipped in shadow, never pausing to ask why the shadows clung to him in the first place. They called him a prince, a demon, a corrupter of men, but they never asked why he stands so still when the screaming starts. They never asked why his eyes, if you ever dare to meet them, hold not fire, but something worse. Something human. Because Beelzebub knows. He knows the prayers that never reach the sky. The bargains made in the dark. the mothers who bled out alone, whispering promises to anything that would listen. The soldiers whose hands shook long after the killing stopped. He knows the way humanity rots from the inside, the way hope curdles into desperation, the way the line between God and monster shatters when the blood is ankle-deep and the prayers taste like begging. They called him evil so they wouldn't have to face the truth, that every rot, every swarm, every whisper in the dark was not a gift from him, but a reflection of us. He is not the disease. He is the mirror held up to the wound, showing every infected inch, every pus-filled pocket of denial. And because no one can look at their own rot without screaming, they scream at him instead. They curse him, name him, drag him through every version of hell they can imagine, and each time he stands there, silent, accepting, the flies gathering at his feet like mourners. He is not innocent. No ancient thing is. His hands are not clean, nor could they ever be. But the stories they tell, stories that paint him with only one color, one hunger, one endless desire to devour and corrupt, those stories tremble under the weight of what they refuse to say. They made him their scapegoat, their villain, their easy answer to the question no one dares speak aloud. What if the rot is ours? What if the flies come not because he calls them, but because they follow the scent of what we hide? What if Beelzebub walks among us not to spread the sickness, but to count the bodies, to witness the lies, to collect the pieces of every shattered soul too broken to cross into the light? What if his wings, torn and filthy as they are, were never meant to carry him into hell, but to lift the lost from the earth before they drowned in their own silence? They will never tell you this. They will keep the stories simple, because simple stories are easier to live with. They will show you horns, fangs, blackened wings, and rivers of rot because it's easier to hate a monster than to mourn a witness. But in the quiet, in the space between prayers, in the moments when the air shifts and you feel something watching, not with hunger, but with something that tastes like sorrow, that is where you will find him. Standing at the edges of every massacre, every plague pit, every battlefield, every broken room where no one came to help. His hands folded. His head bowed. The flies swarming, not to feast, but to sing. Beelzebub is not good. But good was never the point. He is the weight of what we leave behind, the collector of everything we refuse to carry, the watcher at the end of every prayer too ugly for heaven to touch. And no matter how much you curse his name, no matter how tightly you close your eyes when the shadows shift, he will be there, waiting. Because someone has to. Someone has to see the things no one wants to remember. Someone has to stand among the rot and bear witness. Someone has to know the truth. Even if it means becoming the villain they all need. The candle flickered once, twice, then shattered in a hiss of wax and smoke, plunging the room into something darker than absence. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of burnt copper and something else, something alive, crawling just beneath the skin of the world, a presence too large to be contained by walls or reason. It was there, and it had always been there, long before names were carved into stone or prayers stained the air with trembling breath. Somewhere in the silence, a whisper scraped against the bones of the earth, a name, a curse, a warning spat through teeth stained black. Beelzebub. It did not arrive like a storm. It bled into existence like rot seeping through wood, patient, inevitable, the slow decay of certainty itself. Even the shadows flinched at the sound, as though the syllables alone could corrode reality. There is no preparing for something like Beelzebub. There is only the trembling awareness that it watches, and that knowledge is heavier than fear. The name wears countless faces. A demon prince crowned with the bones of those who spoke it too loudly. A god of flies, wings glistening with the filth of cities that begged for mercy until their throats tore open. A fallen angel, flames licking at his feet as his wings were torn from his back one feather at a time. The world has tried, again and again, to give him a shape small enough to fit between the pages of books, but Beelzebub does not live in books. Beelzebub is the thing that crawls out when the books are closed, when the light is gone, when the silence starts to whisper back. Even now, with every heartbeat that echoes too loudly in the ribcage, something stirs. Not because it is called, but because it never left. Beelzebub is not summoned, Beelzebub is remembered. It waits in the breath caught at the edge of a scream, in the crack of wood settling in an empty house, in the reflection that moves just a second too late in a darkened window. It waits, because it knows that terror is a kind of prayer, and prayers always find their way to the ones who listen hardest. There is a reason Beelzebub's name slips between trembling lips in the darkest hours, why even the boldest tongues stutter when it must be said aloud. It is not a name meant for mortal throats. It is the weight of ancient hands pressed against the mouth, a suffocating reminder that silence is safer than calling down something too old, too hungry, too eager to be remembered again. And yet, the name survives. Through centuries of fire and blood, through whispered exorcisms and fevered dreams, it lingers like smoke clinging to cloth long after the fire has died. Because Beelzebub is not a story. Beelzebub is the story beneath the story, the reason children wake crying in the night with no memory of why. The taste of metal on the tongue when the room is too quiet. The sickening certainty that you are not alone even when the doors are locked, the lights are on, and your rational mind insists there is nothing there. There is always something there. And when the air grows thick with silence, Beelzebub is breathing in tandem with you, mouth to mouth, soul to soul, tasting your fear like honey left too long in the sun. For every sermon that condemns him, there is a secret murmur in the dark, those who wonder if the story is wrong, if Beelzebub was not cast down, but walked willingly into the pit. Not a villain, but something worse. Something that understood the weight of divinity and chose to cut it from his back like a tumor, leaving a wound that would never close. A being that knew freedom was bought in blood and chose to pay in the currency of his own flesh. Not a king of demons, but the first to look God in the eye and smile with every tooth he had left. And perhaps that is why Beelzebub endures, not because he is evil, but because he is too much like us. He has fallen, and he has survived. He has been condemned, and he has refused to be erased. His hands are stained with the same sins we all carry, the ones we tuck into the soft folds of our minds and pretend are not there. Beelzebub is not a monster waiting at the edge of the world. Beelzebub is the reflection in the glass when the mask slips, the thing we cannot name but see in every nightmare we dare not speak aloud. Every faith, every culture, every trembling heart has tried to contain him, to press him into words and symbols and desperate prayers for protection. But how do you protect yourself from something that has already found a home inside your chest? Beelzebub is not summoned. Beelzebub is remembered, because something in us remembers him. The first whisper of rebellion, the first taste of defiance, the first understanding that power is sweetest when taken, not given. He was there for all of it. And he remembers us too. There is no exorcism strong enough to erase something that has become part of the world's bones. No silver blade sharp enough to cut out the piece of him that lives inside every trembling heart that dares to crave more than it was given. Beelzebub does not need worship. Beelzebub does not need temples. Beelzebub needs only silence, fear, and the unbearable weight of knowing that even when you are alone, you are not. And so the candle flickers again, fighting for breath in a room too small to hold the weight of what is watching. Wax pools like blood, and somewhere, in the silence between heartbeats, something moves. Not summoned. Not called. Only remembered. And remembrance is the oldest kind of power there is. Beelzebub does not come crashing through doors or tearing through skies. Beelzebub waits. Beelzebub listens. And when the moment is right, when the silence is heavy enough to break your spine, Beelzebub smiles. Because there is no running from something that was already there, standing behind you, mouth close to your ear, waiting for the moment you remember his name.